In the rugged, windswept hills of Corsica, a boy was born who would one day change the course of history forever. Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world on August 15, 1769, at a time when his birthplace, Corsica, had only recently become a French territory. The island, rich in fierce independence and local pride, was a place where Napoleon's future ambitions would be forged under the shadow of conflict. He was born to Carlo Bonaparte, a lawyer, and Letizia Ramolino, his strong-willed mother. Napoleon's family wasn't among the elite of Corsica, but they were certainly well-respected. The Bonapartes were part of the island's rising bourgeoisie, a family with noble aspirations. Carlo, although not wealthy, was ambitious. He saw education as the key to a better life for his children, especially for young Napoleon, who showed a spark of intelligence from an early age. The seeds of ambition, competition, and resilience were planted in Napoleon's childhood, and they would grow into a hunger for power and recognition that would define his life. But it wasn't just ambition that shaped Napoleon. It was also his love for his homeland. Corsica's independence was a battle cry for many of its inhabitants, and the Bonapartes were no strangers to this struggle. Napoleon's father had fought alongside Pasquale Paoli, a leader of Corsica's resistance against French rule. However, in a twist of fate, Carlo switched sides in 1793, aligning with the French. This decision led to the Bonaparte family's rise to prominence in French-controlled Corsica, but it also left a bitter sense of division. Napoleon would later remember his family's role in Corsica's complex political landscape, and it would affect how he viewed power dynamics in his future reign. The young Napoleon, still a child, was sent to mainland France for his education. At the age of just 9, he left behind his beloved Corsica to embark on a journey that would take him far from the warmth of his island home and into the classrooms of French military academies. A boy with a fiery spirit, Napoleon found himself at odds with his fellow students, his Corsican accent, his outsider status, and his pride in his heritage making him an object of both ridicule and admiration. But rather than retreat, Napoleon grew stronger. He learned the language of the French aristocracy, he excelled in his studies, and most importantly, he began to shape himself into a force that would soon demand the world's attention. This was just the beginning. The early life of Napoleon Bonaparte was far from ordinary, and it set the stage for a remarkable ascent that no one, not even he, could have fully anticipated. The seeds of greatness had been planted, but the storm of revolution and war would be the storm that would nurture them into full bloom. By the time Napoleon graduated from Brienne at the age of 16, his education was far from over, but his transformation into a future military genius had already begun. His mind was sharp, his ambition boundless, and his heart set on one singular goal: to rise above his humble origins and become a force that could not be ignored. The road ahead would not be easy, but Napoleon had already taken the first steps toward greatness, armed with nothing but his ambition, his intelligence, and an unwavering belief in his own destiny. However, his journey wasn't without struggle. As a young Corsican boy in a foreign land, Napoleon often felt like an outsider. His rebellious spirit was at odds with the traditional French military establishment, and he faced constant scrutiny from his peers. But rather than retreat, he thrived in adversity. His determination to prove his worth was matched only by his fierce intellect. The boy who struggled with his accent would soon become a master of the French language, and his intellect would become his weapon in the battles to come. Despite the teasing and his outsider status, Napoleon excelled academically. His brilliance was unmistakable, and his teachers recognized his potential. History, mathematics, and geography fascinated him, subjects that would later play a crucial role in his military strategies. But it wasn't just academics where Napoleon stood out. His ambition grew stronger with each passing year. Napoleon was not content simply to learn the conventional tactics and strategies taught at the academy. He began to imagine himself as the master of his own destiny, a man of action rather than theory. At Brienne, Napoleon was confronted with his first significant battle, the French language. His Corsican accent, heavy and distinct, set him apart from his fellow students, many of whom came from aristocratic backgrounds. In the strict, aristocratic world of the French military, this difference was not only noticed, but often ridiculed. For a boy with such a sharp mind and fierce pride in his heritage, this was a blow. Yet, this early adversity would ignite a fire within Napoleon, a desire to prove himself, not just to his classmates, but to the entire world. Napoleon's journey from the sun-kissed shores of Corsica to the austere classrooms of mainland France was one filled with both challenges and revelations. At the age of just 9, Napoleon set sail from his beloved island home, a young boy on the verge of adolescence, carrying the weight of his family's ambitions on his shoulders. He arrived at the prestigious military school of Brienne-le-Château, a distant and unfamiliar place that would soon shape him into the man destined for greatness. Or perhaps, greatness was destined to shape him. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte turned 16, he was no longer the shy, homesick boy from Corsica. He was a young officer, ready to make his mark on the world. Upon graduation from the École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon returned to Corsica, but it wasn't to settle into a life of peace. The island, once his home, had become a political battlefield. Corsica's fierce desire for independence still burned hot, and Napoleon's loyalties were torn between his native land and the growing power of France. In a twist of fate, the same ambition that led Napoleon to leave Corsica would push him into the service of the French Revolutionary Army. As France itself was plunged into the chaos of the Revolution, Napoleon, now a 16-year-old artillery officer, was eager to prove himself. The French Revolution, with all its promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, also unleashed a fierce war within France, against internal rebellion and foreign monarchies alike. And amidst the upheaval, young Napoleon found the perfect opportunity to display his unparalleled strategic mind. By 1793, Napoleon had already experienced his first major military engagement, the Siege of Toulon. Toulon, a key port city, was in the hands of royalists, and France needed to reclaim it. Napoleon, not yet a general, was assigned to direct artillery. It was here that he made his first decisive move that would change the course of his future. In a moment of brilliance, he positioned artillery at a height where the royalists would be most vulnerable, and with a few well-placed cannon shots, he effectively turned the tide of the battle. The city fell back into French hands, and Napoleon, barely in his 20s, earned a promotion to brigadier general. But Napoleon's rise wasn't just about military skill. It was about his ability to capitalize on the political upheaval of the time. The revolution was in full swing, with factions clashing over control. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, were ascendant, and the radical changes sweeping through France created a vacuum that Napoleon was quick to fill. He aligned himself with those who held power, knowing that the right alliances would propel him forward. As the revolution progressed, so too did Napoleon's rise. He understood that the chaos and transformation happening in France were his opportunities, not just challenges. He wasn't just watching history unfold. He was becoming one of its authors. With his brilliance in military strategy and his growing political awareness, Napoleon Bonaparte was about to step onto a stage that would change the world, and the stage was set for his meteoric rise to power. Napoleon Bonaparte's brilliance as a military strategist did not take long to become apparent. By 1795, his reputation had already begun to spread beyond the shores of Corsica and the battlefield of Toulon. After his success in Toulon, Napoleon found himself thrust into the heart of the French Revolution's violent aftermath, where his strategic genius would propel him even further. At just 26 years old, Napoleon was tasked with defending the Convention, the revolutionary government, against a royalist uprising in Paris. The royalists, hoping to restore the monarchy, had gathered thousands of troops to march on the city. They were determined to overthrow the revolutionaries, but they didn't count on Napoleon. Using a mix of surprise, precision, and brute force, Napoleon deployed artillery to devastating effect. His use of canister shots, designed to scatter bullets like a giant shotgun blast, quickly scattered the royalist forces, forcing them to retreat. This victory, known as the whiff of grapeshot, earned Napoleon widespread recognition and firmly established him as one of France's most promising military leaders. But it was not just his battlefield tactics that made Napoleon a rising star. It was his ability to seize opportunities. The French Revolution had turned the country upside down, with a constant turnover of governments. Amidst the chaos, Napoleon saw his moment. In 1796, he was appointed commander of the French army in Italy, a region ripe for conquest. The Italians, under the Austrian Empire, had long resisted French influence, but Napoleon was about to change that. His campaigns in Italy were nothing short of legendary, displaying his unmatched ability to adapt to any situation, whether facing larger forces or unfamiliar terrain. His campaigns in Italy were more than just military victories. They were a masterclass in leadership. Napoleon knew how to inspire his men, how to make them believe in the impossible. His charisma and unwavering confidence turned a ragtag group of soldiers into an unstoppable force. The Battle of Lodi, for example, where Napoleon's forces took a heavily fortified bridge, became one of his most famous triumphs. Napoleon's uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, coupled with his audacity, enabled him to outmaneuver the Austrians and push them back across the Alps. Napoleon's success in Italy solidified his position as France's foremost military leader. The campaign had not only proven his tactical brilliance, but it had also made him a hero to the French people, a symbol of their nation's resurgence. His influence continued to grow, and as he marched through Italy, his eyes were already set on the next step, seizing political power in a country where the very fabric of authority was crumbling. By 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte had become a household name, revered across France for his incredible victories in Italy. The French were hungry for a leader who could restore stability to a nation torn apart by revolution, and Napoleon was more than ready to step into that role. But as his fame grew, so did the tension back in France. The revolutionary government, known as the Directory, was crumbling under internal corruption, foreign threats, and political chaos. The people, exhausted by years of turmoil, were ready for change, but who would lead them? Napoleon, ever the opportunist, saw the moment. After months of campaigning in Italy, he returned to France in late 1797, not as just a military leader, but as a political force. Although the Directory still held power, it was clear that their grip on France was weakening. Napoleon, at the time still seen as a hero, began to cultivate alliances with key political figures who shared his ambitions. Among them was a man named Sise, a member of the Directory who saw the rising general as the key to restoring order to the fractured nation. In the years following his return, Napoleon made strategic moves to secure his influence. He positioned himself as the solution to France's problems, presenting himself not only as a military genius, but as a savior who could bring peace, prosperity, and stability to a broken nation. But it wasn't long before Napoleon recognized that simply aligning with political leaders wouldn't be enough. He needed to take control himself. In November of 1799, with the country teetering on the edge of collapse, Napoleon orchestrated a coup. On the 18th Brumaire, November 9th, Napoleon, backed by his military power, stormed the legislative body and seized control. With the Directory dissolved and chaos sweeping through France, Napoleon installed himself as first consul, effectively placing himself in charge of the French government. The coup was swift, calculated, and bloodless, proof of Napoleon's immense political acumen. He quickly consolidated his power, gaining the support of the French people and political elites alike. His ambition, which had started as a dream of military glory, had now evolved into something far greater: the desire to rule France with unchallenged authority. In his first speech as first consul, Napoleon promised to restore order, end corruption, and provide a vision for France's future. But for all his promises, one thing was clear: the revolution that had started with cries for liberty and equality was now giving way to a new order, a monarchy disguised in revolutionary garb. Napoleon had become the very figure of authority he had once fought against. With Napoleon's coup on November 18, 1799, France entered a new era, one marked by dramatic change and the rise of a man who would reshape the future of not just his nation, but all of Europe. As the new first consul of France, Napoleon wasted no time in asserting his dominance and setting a clear course for the country's future. The political landscape of France was still fractured, the economy in ruins, and the people, tired of revolution and civil war, were desperate for stability. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, understood that to secure his rule, he would need to deliver on that promise. Napoleon's first major move was to establish control over the French government. He surrounded himself with loyal supporters and worked quickly to reorganize the administrative machinery. The revolutionary ideals that had once fueled France were not abandoned, but instead reinterpreted to suit Napoleon's vision. The chaos of the preceding years gave way to a new, centralized government that mirrored the structure of a monarchy, but with the appearance of revolutionary legitimacy. Napoleon knew how to balance the ideals of the revolution with the authority he needed to rule. One of his most significant achievements during this time was the introduction of the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive legal framework. The code aimed to standardize laws across France and offer equal rights to citizens, with a focus on property rights, civil liberty, and the abolition of feudal privileges. It was a groundbreaking effort that would lay the foundation for modern legal systems not just in France, but in many countries around the world. This move solidified Napoleon's image as a reformer, someone who brought order to a land that had been torn apart by years of revolution. Despite his revolutionary rhetoric, Napoleon was careful not to alienate the nobility or the Catholic Church, two powerful institutions that had been deeply affected by the revolution. In 1801, he negotiated a concordat with the Pope, restoring the Catholic Church's influence in France in exchange for the Church's acceptance of Napoleon's regime. This was a masterstroke in diplomacy, allowing him to unite various factions within France under his rule. By 1802, Napoleon's position as first consul was secure, and his vision for France began to take shape. His reforms, while revolutionary, were aimed at creating a nation of stability and prosperity, something that the French had long been denied. But the seeds of his future ambition were also planted during this time. Napoleon's desire for power extended beyond France's borders. He wasn't just content with consolidating power within France. He had Europe in his sights, and he was preparing for the inevitable battles that would crown him emperor. In March of 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte, now just 26 years old, was given one of the most important assignments of his military career, to command a French army in Italy. This was not just any military campaign. It was a turning point for France, a country torn apart by revolution and beset by foreign enemies. The French army in Italy was disorganized, demoralized, and facing a formidable coalition of Austrian and Italian forces. The task before Napoleon seemed nearly impossible. Yet, it was in this very moment of challenge that Napoleon saw the opportunity to not only prove his brilliance, but to reshape the future of France. Napoleon's arrival in Italy marked the beginning of a campaign that would elevate him from a promising general to a military genius. He inherited an army that was fractured and poorly equipped, but he immediately set to work, transforming it into an efficient and disciplined fighting force. His first move was to inspire his troops, giving them a renewed sense of purpose and showing them that victory, while hard-won, was within their grasp. Napoleon's ability to rally his men, to turn fear into determination, became one of his defining traits. He was not just a strategist. He was a leader who could ignite the spirit of his soldiers. At the heart of Napoleon's military strategy was his focus on speed and mobility. He understood that Italy's terrain, with its mountain passes and narrow roads, could work in his favor if used wisely. The French army, led by Napoleon's new tactics, quickly advanced through northern Italy. He implemented innovative strategies, including the use of rapid marches and surprise attacks, to outmaneuver the Austrian forces, who had grown complacent and slow. Napoleon's keen eye for opportunities allowed him to strike when the enemy least expected it. One of his first major victories came at the Battle of Montenotte in April 1796. The French forces, outnumbered and underprepared, faced the Austrian army in a difficult position. But Napoleon's tactical brilliance turned the tide. He divided his forces and attacked the Austrian units in multiple locations, preventing them from coordinating a defense. The French won a decisive victory, and with it, the first step toward dominance in northern Italy was achieved. This victory not only boosted the morale of his troops, but also caught the attention of France's political elite. Napoleon's success in Italy was not just about military might. It was about his ability to inspire and lead, qualities that would soon make him a legend. His march through Italy had just begun, and the world would soon see the true scope of his ambition. As he celebrated his victory, Napoleon's mind was already turning to his next steps. He had proven his ability on the battlefield, but now, with each success, he knew that his power would extend far beyond military conquests. The political landscape of France was shifting, and Napoleon was preparing to play his role in shaping it. The Battle of Lodi was a decisive victory, and it became a symbol of Napoleon's leadership. His ability to turn a dire situation into a triumph made him a hero in the eyes of the French people. His reputation soared, and so did his ambition. From that point on, Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was a legend in the making, someone whose name would echo through the corridors of history. The battle raged for hours, and as the French forces neared the bridge, the Austrian troops began to falter. Their once secure position was now being overrun, and the French, led by their indomitable general, crossed the bridge. The Austrian forces were driven into retreat, and Napoleon's victory was complete. But it wasn't just the military success that mattered. It was the way in which Napoleon had inspired his men to fight through fear, to challenge the impossible, and to emerge victorious. Napoleon's strategy for the battle was as audacious as it was brilliant. Rather than waiting for the Austrians to make a move, he ordered his forces to launch a direct assault across the bridge. But there was a twist. The bridge was heavily guarded, and the Austrian artillery was positioned perfectly to inflict devastating damage on any advancing forces. Napoleon knew that the key to success was speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. He commanded his troops to charge, despite the heavy enemy fire, and with incredible courage, the French soldiers pushed forward, one step at a time. The Austrian forces, despite being heavily outnumbered, had fortified themselves on the far side of the Adda River at Lodi, holding a key bridge that controlled the flow of troops and supplies. Napoleon recognized the strategic importance of this bridge and knew that it was crucial to break the Austrian defenses to maintain momentum. But it was not just the military challenge that Napoleon had to face. He had to prove to his troops that they were capable of overcoming the seemingly insurmountable obstacles before them. As Napoleon Bonaparte continued to lead his army through Italy, his genius on the battlefield became more and more apparent. After the stunning victory at Montenotte, he pushed further into northern Italy, and his next great challenge came at the Battle of Lodi, fought on May 10, 1796. This was a pivotal moment in the campaign, one that would not only solidify Napoleon's place as a rising star in the military world, but also change the course of his career forever. The Battle of Lodi had propelled Napoleon Bonaparte to the forefront of military strategy, but his work in Italy was far from over. The victory had given him a reputation as a military genius, but now he had to show the world that his success was no fluke. Napoleon's next challenge was the siege of Mantua, a crucial Italian city that lay in the heart of Austrian-controlled northern Italy. Its fall would grant France control of northern Italy, effectively crippling the Austrian presence in the region. But taking Mantua wouldn't be easy. It was one of the most well-defended cities in Europe, and the Austrian forces had fortified their position with determination and resilience. Napoleon knew that to win the campaign, he would need more than just brute force. He needed to outthink the Austrians, to wear them down, and to turn the city's defenses against them. And so, he did what he did best. He attacked the problem from all angles. Rather than launching a full frontal assault, Napoleon decided to encircle the city. He split his forces, sending one group of soldiers to cut off reinforcements, while another isolated the city from the outside world. This was the kind of thinking that had already become Napoleon's hallmark: strategic, calculated, and creative. The siege began in earnest in late 1796, and, as the days passed, the tension inside Mantua mounted. The Austrian defenders, led by Joseph Alvinci, made repeated attempts to break through Napoleon's encirclement. But every attempt was foiled by Napoleon's superior tactics. His soldiers, fueled by the same audacity and resilience that had defined previous victories, held their ground, even as the siege dragged on. Napoleon, for his part, was meticulous in overseeing the operation, ensuring that his soldiers remained motivated and disciplined. By February 1797, Napoleon's forces had effectively trapped the Austrians within the city. With no hope of reinforcements and their supplies dwindling, the Austrian forces were forced to surrender. The siege of Mantua had lasted nearly 5 months, but in the end, it was Napoleon's relentless strategy, combined with his uncanny ability to keep his troops motivated despite the hardships, that led to victory. The capture of Mantua marked a turning point in the Italian campaign. It not only crippled Austrian influence in northern Italy, but also cemented Napoleon's reputation as a military leader capable of achieving the impossible. As the French flag flew over the city, Napoleon's name echoed throughout Europe as a symbol of military brilliance and the rise of a new power. With the siege of Mantua behind him, Napoleon Bonaparte was now on the brink of securing total victory in Italy. The Austrian forces had been driven from northern Italy, and Napoleon's reputation as an unstoppable force was only growing. But as successful as the military campaign had been, Napoleon knew that victory on the battlefield was only part of the story. To truly secure his position, and to make France the dominant power in Europe, he would have to negotiate peace and solidify his military gains with political savvy. In the spring of 1797, Napoleon turned his attention to the diplomatic front. The Austrians, now thoroughly beaten, were eager for peace, and Napoleon saw an opportunity to shape the future of Europe. He began to press for a treaty, one that would secure France's newfound position in Italy and strip Austria of its influence in the region. The result was the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797. This treaty marked the official end of the war between France and Austria, and it would change the balance of power in Europe. The terms of the treaty were hugely beneficial to France. Austria ceded control of much of northern Italy, including the rich region of Lombardy, to France, while other territories were given to French allies. In exchange, France agreed to respect Austria's holdings elsewhere in Europe, allowing them to maintain influence in Central Europe. For Napoleon, this was more than just a diplomatic victory. It was a political triumph. He had not only defeated Austria on the battlefield, but now he had shaped the future of Europe in France's favor. Napoleon's role in negotiating the treaty elevated his status from a mere military commander to a statesman of unparalleled skill. He had become the face of France's new power in Europe, and with this newfound influence, his ambitions only grew. He returned to Paris, where he was greeted as a hero. The French people, weary of revolution and civil strife, saw in Napoleon a figure who could bring stability and glory back to their country. But Napoleon was not content to rest on his laurels. The Treaty of Campo Formio was just the beginning of his larger plans. As he consolidated his power in Italy, he began to eye the rest of Europe. His vision was clear. Not only would France dominate Italy, but it would also establish its supremacy over the entire continent. The Treaty of Campo Formio marked the end of the Italian campaign, but it also set the stage for the next phase of Napoleon's rise to power, one that would stretch far beyond Italy's borders. Napoleon Bonaparte's success in Italy had already made him a hero in the eyes of the French people, but his return to Paris in 1797 would mark the beginning of his greatest rise to power. After the Treaty of Campo Formio, which brought peace with Austria and secured French dominance in Italy, Napoleon was not just a military leader. He was a symbol of French strength and glory. The French Revolution, which had torn the nation apart, was slowly giving way to the stability that many people yearned for, and Napoleon appeared to be the man to bring it. Upon his return to Paris, Napoleon was greeted with fanfare by a populace eager for peace after years of upheaval. His victories on the battlefield had earned him widespread admiration, and his ability to secure such a favorable peace treaty only cemented his position. Yet, while the public adored him, the political situation in France remained complicated. The Directory, the ruling government of France, was weak and divided, burdened by internal corruption, economic instability, and a lack of popular support. Napoleon, ever the shrewd politician, saw an opportunity. Although Napoleon's military successes had made him a legend, he knew that to gain full control of France, he needed to align himself with the political elite. He quickly navigated the complex web of factions and began forging relationships with key figures within the Directory. However, Napoleon was not content to simply be another player in the existing system. He had grander ambitions. He wanted more than influence. He wanted power. In Paris, Napoleon found the political landscape in chaos. The revolution had radically transformed France, but the country remained in a state of uncertainty. The Directory was corrupt and ineffectual, and the French people, exhausted by war and instability, longed for a strong leader who could bring order and prosperity. Napoleon, sensing this deep-seated discontent, positioned himself as the solution to France's problems. His vision of a stable, powerful France resonated with the public, and his reputation as a military genius gave him the credibility to lead. By the end of 1797, Napoleon's influence in Paris had grown considerably. He wasn't just a celebrated general anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with in French politics. The French Directory, already under pressure, now found itself facing a man who had proven his military brilliance and who was willing to step into the political vacuum left by the Revolution. Napoleon's rise was inevitable. With the French people and the political elite behind him, he was ready to make his next move, one that would ultimately change the course of French history forever. By 1799, the French Directory had become a deeply unpopular and ineffective government, struggling under the weight of internal corruption, military failures, and economic instability. While the French people longed for stability, the Directory had failed to deliver it, and the situation was growing increasingly dire. It was in this environment of frustration and chaos that Napoleon Bonaparte, who had spent years building his influence, saw his moment. The political landscape was ripe for change, and Napoleon, ever the opportunist, would soon make his bold move. Napoleon had been carefully cultivating relationships with key political figures, and by late 1799, he had gained the support of prominent men, such as Emmanuel Joseph Size, one of the directors, and Pierre-Roger Ducasse, who saw in Napoleon the answer to France's growing discontent. The plan was simple. Napoleon would use his military might and popularity to overthrow the Directory, replace it with a more stable government, and restore order to France. However, this wasn't just a military coup. It was a carefully orchestrated political takeover that would solidify Napoleon's power and lay the groundwork for his future rule. On November 9, 1799, or 18 Brumaire, Napoleon and his allies launched their coup. The plan was to dissolve the Directory and replace it with a new governing body, known as the Consulate, with Napoleon at its helm. Initially, Napoleon's forces marched into Paris with the intention of taking control of the government buildings, but the coup did not go off without resistance. The Directory's defenders, still holding some power, attempted to block Napoleon's path. But with the backing of his army, Napoleon swiftly outmaneuvered the opposition, and by the end of the day, he had successfully seized power. The coup was largely bloodless, but it marked the end of the revolutionary government and the beginning of Napoleon's political reign. The French people, exhausted by years of chaos, were ready for a strong leader, and Napoleon's promise of stability and reform resonated deeply. He quickly positioned himself as the head of the new government, but he didn't take the title of king or emperor, at least not yet. Instead, Napoleon became First Consul of France, a position that granted him almost unchecked power, but with the appearance of a republic. Napoleon's rise was complete. The chaos of the Revolution had given way to the vision of a man who promised to restore France to glory. With the power of the French army and the support of political allies, he was now in control, ready to take France and Europe into a new era. With the success of the coup of 18 Brumaire and his subsequent rise to the position of First Consul, Napoleon Bonaparte now stood at the pinnacle of French power. The revolution that had begun in 1789, with its cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity, had given way to a new kind of leadership, a strong, centralized authority that promised stability and order. But while the French people had celebrated the fall of the monarchy, they were now looking for a leader who could bring an end to the chaos, the wars, and the instability that had plagued the nation for nearly a decade. Napoleon was their answer. Upon taking office in December 1799, Napoleon wasted no time in consolidating his power. He swiftly moved to dismantle the old revolutionary structures that had been ineffectual and replace them with a new constitution that would solidify his control. The Constitution of the year 8, which was ratified by plebiscite, established a consulate with 3 consuls at the helm, but it was clear that Napoleon would be the most powerful of the 3. As First Consul, he wielded executive power and controlled both the military and the administration, effectively becoming the ruler of France. One of Napoleon's first major reforms was the reorganization of the legal system. The country had been devastated by years of upheaval, and its laws were in disarray. To bring order, Napoleon introduced the Napoleonic Code, a sweeping set of laws that would influence legal systems across the globe. The code standardized laws regarding property, civil rights, and legal procedure, abolishing feudal privileges and giving citizens clear, predictable legal rights. This legal reform not only earned him respect among the French population, but also presented him as the guardian of the revolution's ideals, even as he centralized power in his own hands. Along with legal reform, Napoleon turned his attention to the economy. France had been ravaged by war, revolution, and instability, and Napoleon recognized that economic reform was essential for securing the nation's future. He established the Bank of France in 1800, stabilized the currency, and introduced measures to regulate the economy. His reforms helped restore confidence in the financial system, and by the time he crowned himself emperor in 1804, France's economy was far more stable than it had been in years. Napoleon also worked to reconcile with the Catholic Church, which had been a bitter enemy of the Revolution. In 1801, he negotiated the Concordat of 1801, which re-established the Church's influence in France while maintaining the Revolution's principles of religious freedom and state control. By doing so, he gained the support of millions of French Catholics, who had long felt alienated by the Revolution's anti-clerical stance. By the end of 1802, Napoleon's power was effectively unchallenged. Through a series of military victories, political maneuvers, and strategic reforms, he had transformed France from a fractured, war-torn country into a strong, centralized state under his command. Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was the leader of France, and the road to his imperial ambitions was just beginning. In the early years of the 19th century, France was on the brink of a new era, one where the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity would be redefined under the leadership of a single, powerful figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. Having secured his position as first consul in 1799 after the successful coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon's next step was to solidify his control over France and transform the volatile, post-revolutionary government into a stable, efficient regime. Napoleon had proven himself as a military genius, but now it was time to prove that he could also govern. Napoleon's first order of business was to ensure that his hold on power was unchallenged. France, still recovering from the upheaval of the Revolution, was ripe for a strong, centralized government. The Directory had been weak and ineffective, and the French people, exhausted from years of instability, were ready for a leader who could bring order and security. Napoleon, understanding this sentiment, set out to reshape the government in his image. In 1800, Napoleon pushed for a new constitution that would solidify his power. The Constitution of the year 8 created a consulate, but it was designed in such a way that Napoleon, as first consul, held nearly all of the executive power. This allowed him to control both the military and the administration, effectively giving him dictatorial authority under the guise of republicanism. Though there were other consuls, it was clear that Napoleon was the dominant force in the French government. He had transformed the position of first consul into that of the ruler of France, and the people accepted it, eager for the stability he promised. Napoleon's popularity grew not only because of his military victories, but also because of his ability to bring order to a fractured nation. One of his first actions as first consul was to restore order to France's economy, which had been in ruins after the Revolution. He established the Bank of France in 1800, which helped stabilize the country's finances and manage its war debt. He also introduced measures to ensure the smooth functioning of the economy, including the stabilization of currency and the regulation of trade. Napoleon understood that a stable economy was key to gaining the loyalty of the people, and these reforms proved to be a success. On the political front, Napoleon worked tirelessly to forge alliances and bring about reconciliation between the various factions in French society. Perhaps his most notable achievement was his rapprochement with the Catholic Church. Through the Concordat of 1801, Napoleon re-established the Church's authority in France, ensuring that Catholicism would be recognized as the religion of the majority, while still maintaining state control over religious affairs. This move not only strengthened Napoleon's position, but also helped heal the rift caused by the Revolution's anti-clerical policies. Napoleon had effectively consolidated his power, transformed France's political landscape, and won the support of key institutions. But his vision extended beyond France. As first consul, he was already planning for the next phase, creating an empire that would reshape Europe. As Napoleon Bonaparte consolidated his power in the early years of the 19th century, he knew that to truly solidify his rule and leave a lasting legacy, he had to bring stability to all aspects of French society, not just its military and politics, but also its legal system. The Napoleonic Code, one of Napoleon's most significant and enduring reforms, was introduced in 1804 and would go on to influence legal systems across the globe. But its origins can be traced back to Napoleon's years as first consul, when he began working tirelessly to create a legal framework that reflected the core values of the French Revolution while offering the stability and clarity that the people desperately needed. Prior to Napoleon's reign, France's legal system was a patchwork of feudal laws, revolutionary decrees, and local customs that often contradicted one another. This lack of uniformity had created confusion, inefficiency, and uncertainty, exactly the kind of environment Napoleon had worked to eliminate. His vision was clear: a unified set of laws that could provide stability and equality for all citizens, regardless of their social class or origin. Napoleon's approach to law was practical and pragmatic. The Code Civil, which would later become known as the Napoleonic Code, sought to enshrine the principles of the Revolution, particularly the notions of equality before the law and the protection of private property. The code abolished feudal privileges, reinforcing the ideals of liberty and equality. It granted individuals the right to own property, make contracts, and pass on inheritance according to their wishes, key elements of Napoleon's vision for a modern society built on merit and personal rights. However, the Napoleonic Code was not just about equality and liberty. It was also about control. Napoleon used the code to strengthen his own authority by centralizing the law under the state. Local courts were required to adhere to the code's principles, effectively reducing the power of regional or aristocratic influence. The code also reinforced the role of men as the heads of households, which reflected Napoleon's conservative views on gender roles. His reforms provided for equal rights for men, but women remained largely excluded from the same legal protections. Beyond its role in shaping French society, the Napoleonic Code was a crucial tool for Napoleon to maintain order across his empire. As he expanded his influence over Europe, the code became the basis for legal systems in many of the territories he conquered. Its simplicity and clarity made it easier for governments to adopt, and it provided a foundation for governance in regions that had been previously divided by conflicting legal traditions. Napoleon's commitment to reforming the legal system was just one of many ways he sought to create a lasting, stable empire. His reforms helped restore order to a country that had been devastated by revolution and war, and in doing so, he strengthened his hold on France. The Napoleonic Code was more than just a set of laws. It was a testament to Napoleon's vision for a new, modern Europe under his leadership. While Napoleon Bonaparte's military successes had earned him fame, it was his domestic reforms that truly cemented his hold on power. As first consul, Napoleon understood that a stable government could only be built on a solid foundation of strong institutions, and he wasted no time in reorganizing France to ensure that power remained centralized and secure under his leadership. His aim was not only to stabilize the country, but also to create a lasting legacy, one that would serve as the cornerstone of his growing empire. One of Napoleon's first priorities was to restore economic stability to France, which had been ravaged by years of revolution and warfare. Under the revolutionary government, France had faced hyperinflation, a collapsed currency, and a wrecked economy. Napoleon addressed this by founding the Bank of France in 1800. This institution helped stabilize the French currency and manage the country's debt, creating confidence in the economy. By ensuring that the bank was independent of political influence, Napoleon set the stage for long-term financial stability, which in turn, in addition to stabilizing the economy, Napoleon also took significant steps to restructure the government. He reorganized the administrative divisions of France, reducing the influence of the old feudal systems. Local authorities were replaced with prefects who were directly accountable to Napoleon, ensuring that power flowed from the top down. This move was crucial in centralizing authority and preventing any local opposition from challenging his rule. His administrative reforms made the government more efficient, ensuring that France was governed with greater consistency and control, which was essential for the success of his future empire. Napoleon also sought to balance the needs of the revolution with the realities of power. One of the most notable aspects of his rule was his approach to religion. The revolution had led to the suppression of the Catholic Church, with many properties confiscated and religious institutions diminished in power. However, Napoleon recognized that the Catholic Church still held immense influence over the French people. In 1801, he negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope, which re-established Catholicism as the dominant religion in France, while ensuring that the state retained control over church affairs. This move helped to mend a rift between the government and the church, securing the loyalty of millions of French Catholics without compromising his own authority. Napoleon's policies were designed to strengthen the state and create a stable society under his rule. While he embraced the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, he did so in a way that reinforced his own central authority. His reforms were not merely about restoring order. They were about building a new French state, one that could withstand both internal and external pressures. With his centralized control, economic stabilization, and strategic alliances, Napoleon set the stage for the next chapter of his reign, the creation of an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte's genius was not confined to politics and law. It was, above all, rooted in his understanding of warfare. As first consul, Napoleon's military vision was central to his plans for both stabilizing France and expanding his empire. Despite France's recent struggles in battle, particularly with the ongoing wars against European coalitions, Napoleon's leadership would soon transform the French military into one of the most formidable fighting forces in Europe. His reforms would not only strengthen the army's effectiveness, but also inspire loyalty and admiration among his troops. Upon assuming power, Napoleon recognized that the French army needed to be restructured and revitalized. The previous years of the revolution had left the military fractured, with widespread unrest and morale at an all-time low. But Napoleon, ever the strategist, understood that the army could be a powerful instrument to achieve his political and imperial ambitions. One of his first military reforms was to centralize control of the army and make it more disciplined. He reintroduced merit-based promotions, where officers were selected based on their abilities and battlefield success, rather than their social status or noble birth. This move ensured that the military was staffed with capable leaders, loyal to Napoleon and his vision. Additionally, Napoleon worked to reorganize the French military to make it more flexible and responsive to the demands of modern warfare. He established a corps system, which divided the army into smaller, self-sufficient units, each capable of operating independently, yet still coordinated under a central command. This system of organization gave Napoleon the flexibility to deploy his forces quickly and efficiently, adapting to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The corps system was a major innovation in military tactics, allowing Napoleon to concentrate his forces when needed and spread them out across vast distances without losing command and control. Napoleon also revamped the training and equipment of his soldiers. The conscription system was expanded to increase the size of the army, and soldiers were trained to a higher standard, especially in the art of rapid marching and tactical formations. These changes turned Napoleon's army into a well-oiled machine, capable of executing his ambitious plans with remarkable speed and precision. But perhaps the most important aspect of Napoleon's military reforms was his ability to inspire his soldiers. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who ruled with fear or distance, Napoleon cultivated a deep loyalty among his men. He often referred to his soldiers as his children, and they, in turn, revered him as their leader and savior. His personal presence on the battlefield, his charisma, and his ability to share in their hardships endeared him to his troops, forging a bond that would be crucial in the years to come. This sense of loyalty and camaraderie became one of the defining features of Napoleon's army and contributed significantly to his military successes. Through these reforms, Napoleon didn't just rebuild France's military. He created an unstoppable force that would go on to dominate Europe for years to come. The army, now stronger and more cohesive, would be the instrument through which he achieved his dreams of empire. Napoleon Bonaparte's vision for France went far beyond its borders. His military genius and domestic reforms had already transformed the nation, but it was his bold foreign policy and expansionist ambitions that would ultimately shape his legacy. As first consul, Napoleon understood that to secure France's future, he needed to expand its influence across Europe and beyond, creating an empire that would rival those of ancient Rome and modern Britain. But this was not just about conquest. It was about securing France's position as the dominant power on the continent. Napoleon's foreign policy was driven by a combination of strategic necessity and personal ambition. One of his primary goals was to ensure that France remained secure from external threats. At the time, France was surrounded by a coalition of monarchies that viewed the French Revolution as a dangerous force. Napoleon's solution was not only to defend French borders, but to expand them, creating buffer zones and establishing satellite states that would support France's interests. In 1801, Napoleon turned his attention to the peace process in Europe. He had already secured a favorable treaty with Austria through the Treaty of Campo Formio after his victories in Italy, but the threat from Great Britain remained. Napoleon sought to weaken Britain's position by targeting its colonial empire. The most notable example of this was the Battle of the Nile in 1798, where Napoleon's failed Egyptian campaign ultimately failed to undermine British dominance in the Mediterranean. However, the British Navy under Admiral Nelson struck a decisive blow, defeating Napoleon's fleet at Abu Qir Bay. Despite this setback, Napoleon remained undeterred. He understood that military setbacks were part of the game, and his ambition would remain unshaken. In addition to military tactics, Napoleon pursued diplomatic efforts to create a network of alliances that would secure French interests. He recognized the importance of the Holy Roman Empire and sought to weaken it by aligning himself with German states. In 1801, Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of Lunéville with Austria, which confirmed the territorial gains France had made during the Italian campaigns. This not only strengthened France's position in Central Europe, but also allowed Napoleon to focus on his ambitions in the West and South. Napoleon's most ambitious move came in 1804, when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was the realization of his vision for a new European order under French dominance. By declaring himself emperor, Napoleon positioned France at the center of a vast empire, with its influence stretching from Spain and Italy to the heart of Germany and the Low Countries. His coronation marked a clear break from the ideals of the French Revolution, signaling that Napoleon had successfully consolidated power and was now embarking on the creation of a new imperial France. Napoleon's foreign policy was defined by his pursuit of power through both diplomacy and military force. With a growing network of allies and satellite states, he aimed to reshape Europe in France's image. His ambitions were not simply about territorial expansion. They were about establishing a French-led European order that would be unchallenged for generations to come. In 1804, after years of consolidating his power as first consul and transforming France into a centralized and stable state, Napoleon Bonaparte took the final, dramatic step in his rise to absolute authority. He declared himself Emperor of the French. This move was a culmination of his political and military successes, a clear departure from the ideals of the French Revolution, and the establishment of a new monarchy under the guise of republicanism. The coronation was not just a personal ambition. It marked the birth of the Napoleonic Empire, a new order that Napoleon envisioned would reshape Europe and secure French dominance for years to come. Napoleon's decision to crown himself emperor was symbolic of his absolute control over France. In a stunning break from tradition, he chose not to wait for the Pope to crown him, as had been the custom for centuries. Instead, during his coronation ceremony at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on December 2, 1804, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it upon his own head. This act was deeply symbolic. It demonstrated that Napoleon saw himself as the source of his own authority, not beholden to the church, nor any other institution. In this dramatic moment, Napoleon was making a statement that he was not simply a product of the revolution, but its culmination. The coronation also reflected Napoleon's vision for France. By crowning himself, he portrayed the empire as the legitimate successor to the revolution's ideals, while also acknowledging the necessity of strong, centralized authority to maintain order. The coronation ceremony, lavish and grand, was designed to project power and grandeur, signaling the start of a new era. But it was also a political maneuver. By claiming the title of emperor, Napoleon sought to distance himself from the instability and chaos of the revolutionary period and to legitimize his rule in the eyes of both the French people and the European powers. Napoleon's empire, unlike the absolute monarchies of the past, was rooted in merit and national strength. The Napoleonic Code, his legal reforms, and his military triumphs had earned him legitimacy among the French people, who had come to see him as a protector of the nation's future. The empire would, in many ways, be an extension of the Republic's ideals, even as it shifted toward monarchy. Yet, even as Napoleon ascended to the throne, he was not naive about the challenges ahead. His coronation was not just about cementing his position in France. It was also a signal to the rest of Europe that he intended to expand his power. Napoleon was not content to simply rule France. He had bigger ambitions for Europe. His empire, though newly crowned, was already set on a path of military expansion that would dominate the continent for the next decade. With his coronation as emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte firmly established the Napoleonic Empire, signaling the beginning of a new chapter in French and European history. But the real test of his power was not just in the ceremonial acts or grand gestures. It lay in the expansion and consolidation of his empire through military conquest and political maneuvering. Napoleon's ambitions reached far beyond France's borders. His vision was of a European continent under French influence, where he would impose stability, order, and the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, albeit in a manner that served his imperial agenda. Napoleon's first major military test as emperor came in 1805, when he faced a new coalition of European powers determined to contain French expansion. The coalition, consisting of Britain, Austria, Russia, and others, sought to end the growing dominance of France and to restore the balance of power in Europe. But Napoleon's military genius was unparalleled, and he once again proved why he was Europe's most feared general. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2, 1805, was one of the most decisive battles of Napoleon's career and solidified his reputation as one of history's greatest military tacticians. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, it saw Napoleon's French forces decisively defeat the Russian and Austrian armies. The victory, which Napoleon himself considered his finest, was a masterclass in battlefield strategy. By feigning weakness and luring the Allied forces into a vulnerable position, Napoleon struck at their center with precision and overwhelming force, leading to a complete rout of the enemy. The consequences of Austerlitz were profound. Napoleon's victory shattered the Third Coalition and left much of Europe in disarray. As a result, Napoleon was able to impose his terms in the Treaty of Pressburg, 1805, which forced Austria to cede significant territories and recognized French influence over much of Central Europe. In the wake of this triumph, Napoleon's power was at its peak. His empire now stretched across the majority of Europe, with French allies or satellite states in Italy, Spain, and the German states. But Napoleon's ambitions didn't stop there. His desire for supremacy over all of Europe remained unwavering, and his next steps would lay the groundwork for even more extensive campaigns. In 1806, following his success at Austerlitz, Napoleon began reorganizing much of Europe under French control. He created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states that were now under his influence, and enforced the Continental System, which sought to cripple Britain's economy by blocking its trade with Europe. Despite his dominance, Napoleon faced increasing challenges in his quest for complete European hegemony. The British Navy remained a powerful adversary, and the eventual resistance from Spain and Russia would test the strength of his empire. But in these early years, Napoleon's military campaigns laid the foundation for his vision of a united Europe under French leadership. In the years following his coronation as emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte set in motion a series of military campaigns that would expand the Napoleonic Empire across much of Europe. By this time, France was no longer just a nation. It had become the nucleus of a rapidly growing empire, with Napoleon at its heart. The strength of Napoleon's leadership, his military genius, and his ability to consolidate power would shape Europe for the next decade, as he aimed to bring the entire continent under his rule. After the Treaty of Pressburg in 1805, which confirmed his dominance in Central Europe, Napoleon continued to consolidate his control over European territories. His military successes, such as the victory at Austerlitz, had decimated his enemies and left France in a commanding position. Yet, his ambitions were far from satisfied. Napoleon understood that his empire needed to grow if it were to endure, and with this in mind, he pursued expansion with relentless determination. In 1806, Napoleon turned his attention to Prussia, a rising military power that was still determined to challenge French authority. The Battle of Jena Auerstedt in October of that year became one of the most crushing defeats in Prussian history. Napoleon's forces utterly destroyed the Prussian army, further solidifying French dominance in Central and Northern Europe. This victory was pivotal, as it marked the end of Prussia as a major military threat and led to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, a group of German states aligned with France, effectively bringing much of modern-day Germany under French influence. Following his triumph over Prussia, Napoleon turned his gaze westward, where Spain had become a key ally. However, as the years passed, Napoleon's relationship with Spain became increasingly strained. In 1808, he placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne in a move to control the Iberian Peninsula. This act of expansion triggered widespread unrest and the Peninsular War, as the Spanish people, supported by the British, fiercely resisted Napoleon's rule. While the Peninsular War would drag on and test Napoleon's resolve, his dominance in Central and Eastern Europe remained largely unchallenged during the early years of the empire. His empire had now grown to include Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, much of Germany, and various other territories. France had become the central power in Europe, with Napoleon as its undisputed leader. Napoleon's success on the battlefield, coupled with his diplomatic skill, had transformed him from a revolutionary leader to the emperor of a vast and ambitious empire. Yet, even at the height of his power, his expansionist ambitions remained as fierce as ever. Europe had been reshaped under his rule, but the seeds of future conflict, especially with Britain and Russia, were already sown. Napoleon's quest for European dominance was far from over. Napoleon Bonaparte's vision for European domination was not solely based on military might. It was also built on economic strategy. As his empire expanded across the continent, one of the central pillars of his foreign policy became the Continental System, a blockade designed to cripple Britain's economy and prevent its access to European markets. The idea was simple. By cutting off Britain's trade with Europe, Napoleon hoped to weaken its economic power, disrupt its industries, and ultimately bring the British Empire to its knees. This system, however, would prove to be a double-edged sword, with both successes and significant challenges that would impact Napoleon's empire. The Continental System, initiated in 1806, was Napoleon's answer to Britain's superior navy, which had long kept France from directly challenging British control of the seas. As Britain relied heavily on its overseas trade, especially with its colonies, Napoleon believed that cutting off British goods from European markets would force Britain to sue for peace, making it easier for France to establish its dominance over the continent. Napoleon's reach extended across most of Europe, and the Continental System placed heavy restrictions on neutral nations and French allies, compelling them to cut off trade with Britain. The system included blockades on key ports and the exclusion of British goods from European markets. At its height, the Continental System appeared to be a resounding success. British imports to Europe dropped significantly, and Napoleon's empire enjoyed the upper hand in economic influence. However, the Continental System came with significant challenges. Firstly, the policy of forcing European nations into compliance often created tensions. Countries like Spain, Russia, and Portugal, though initially aligned with France, grew increasingly resentful of the economic and political pressure that came with the blockade. These tensions ultimately led to outright conflict, as seen with the Peninsular War in Spain and the growing friction with Russia. The Russian Empire, which had initially supported the continental system, began to resist Napoleon's demands, recognizing that the blockade was harming its own economy and disrupting trade with Britain. Additionally, Britain found ways to circumvent the blockade by increasing trade with countries outside of Europe, including the United States and Latin America. British naval superiority allowed it to continue importing goods through its vast network of overseas colonies, limiting the effectiveness of the continental system. Smuggling and black market trading became rampant, particularly in regions where Napoleon's control was weakest. Despite its initial success in weakening Britain's economic position, the continental system eventually backfired. It strained relations between Napoleon and some of his allies, disrupted the economies of the nations involved, and contributed to growing dissatisfaction with his rule. In the long run, the policy only hardened Britain's resolve, and its naval power remained a key obstacle to Napoleon's goal of European domination. The continental system, while ambitious, was not the decisive blow Napoleon had hoped for. It was a constant source of friction that would eventually contribute to the downfall of his empire. The Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, stands as one of the most challenging and prolonged conflicts of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign. It was a war that would not only test Napoleon's military prowess, but also strain the very foundations of his expanding empire. The war began as a result of Napoleon's attempts to control the Iberian Peninsula, with the ultimate goal of tightening his grip on Europe. The war would see the French forces fighting against the Spanish, Portuguese, and British, creating a protracted conflict that would become Napoleon's first real military setback. The origins of the Peninsular War can be traced back to Napoleon's decision to place his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain in 1808. This move was part of Napoleon's broader strategy to control Europe, but it was a grave miscalculation. The Spanish people, who had long resisted foreign domination, rejected the imposition of a foreign king and revolted against French occupation. The Spanish resistance was further fueled by Napoleon's decision to move troops through Spain and Portugal in an effort to enforce the continental system, which added to the resentment of the French presence. The Spanish rebellion quickly escalated into full-scale war. While Napoleon's military machine was formidable, the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Spanish made it difficult for French forces to maintain control over the country. The Spanish people, motivated by nationalist fervor and a desire to expel the foreign occupiers, engaged in hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and sabotage, which inflicted significant losses on the French army. The guerrilla warfare style of combat proved to be a costly and draining experience for the French, as they struggled to maintain their hold over the vast Spanish countryside. In addition to the Spanish resistance, Napoleon faced the British army, led by Sir Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington. The British sent reinforcements to aid the Spanish and Portuguese in their fight against the French. The British Navy, with its dominance at sea, also played a critical role by preventing French forces from receiving reinforcements and supplies, further hindering Napoleon's military efforts. The British, though outnumbered, were able to coordinate effective campaigns in Spain and Portugal, challenging Napoleon's forces at every turn. The Peninsular War became a costly drain on French resources. Napoleon had to divert soldiers and supplies from other theaters of war, which weakened his overall military position. The prolonged conflict not only tied down large numbers of French troops, but also eroded Napoleon's popularity back home. The French public, initially supportive of Napoleon's imperial ambitions, grew increasingly frustrated with the endless war and the mounting casualties. The war ultimately proved to be a decisive factor in Napoleon's eventual downfall. The combination of Spanish resistance, British intervention, and the strain on French resources made the Peninsular War one of Napoleon's most difficult and expensive conflicts. Though he would eventually gain some tactical victories, the war sapped the strength of the Napoleonic Empire and set the stage for the eventual coalition forces to rise up against him. The Russian campaign of 1812 is perhaps the most famous and most disastrous military campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign. After years of dominance across Europe, Napoleon's empire began to face cracks in its foundation. One of the most significant cracks was the deteriorating relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia. The two emperors had once been allies, but the breakdown of diplomatic relations, coupled with Napoleon's desire to expand his empire, led to the invasion of Russia, which would turn into a catastrophic failure for the French Empire. The seeds of the Russian conflict were sown by the continental system, which had already created tension across Europe. While Napoleon sought to enforce the blockade of Britain, Tsar Alexander had begun to ignore it, resuming trade with Britain. This defiance angered Napoleon, who could not afford to let any major European power undermine the system. In June 1812, Napoleon decided to invade Russia to force Tsar Alexander to comply. Napoleon gathered one of the largest armies in history, the Grande Armée, which numbered over 600,000 men, a diverse force composed of French soldiers and troops from across Europe, including Germany, Poland, Italy, and other satellite states. Napoleon's initial plan was to quickly defeat the Russian forces, forcing Tsar Alexander into negotiations. However, the Russian strategy was fundamentally different from the battles Napoleon had fought in Europe. Rather than confronting the Grande Armée head-on, the Russians adopted a scorched earth policy, systematically retreating while destroying everything in their wake: farms, villages, and resources, denying Napoleon's army supplies and food. The Russian army, led by Tsar Alexander, retreated further into the interior of the vast Russian land, refusing to engage in a decisive battle, hoping to wear down Napoleon's forces through attrition. As the French army advanced into Russia, the journey became a logistical nightmare. The French soldiers were poorly supplied, suffering from extreme weather conditions, disease, and starvation. Napoleon's troops, far from their home base, found it increasingly difficult to stay equipped and fed. The Russians, meanwhile, destroyed crops and poisoned wells, further weakening Napoleon's already strained forces. The turning point came with the Battle of Borodino in September 1812, one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Though the French emerged victorious, the cost in lives was staggering, and Napoleon failed to achieve a decisive victory. He then made the fateful decision to march on Moscow, hoping that capturing the Russian capital would force Tsar Alexander to capitulate. Upon entering Moscow, Napoleon found the city largely abandoned and in flames. Russian citizens had burned their homes and the city itself to deny the French army shelter and supplies. After weeks of waiting for Tsar Alexander to negotiate, with no response forthcoming, Napoleon was forced to retreat in late October. By then, winter had set in, and the Grande Armée, severely weakened by cold, disease, and hunger, began its disastrous retreat from Russia. The retreat from Moscow turned into a rout. Harassed by Russian troops and suffering from the brutal winter, Napoleon's army was decimated. Fewer than 100,000 men from the original 600,000 made it back to France. The Russian campaign had been a catastrophic failure, and it marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The disastrous failure of the Russian campaign in 1812 was a critical turning point in Napoleon Bonaparte's reign. His once dominant empire, which had stretched across most of Europe, was now severely weakened. The losses in Russia, both in terms of men and morale, sent shockwaves through Napoleon's forces and sparked a wave of resistance across the continent. The Russian defeat exposed vulnerabilities, and what followed was the Sixth Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Sweden, Portugal, and a number of German states, all united in their determination to bring down Napoleon once and for all. The defeat in Russia had a profound impact on Napoleon's position. His once mighty Grande Armée, now reduced to a fraction of its original strength, was no longer the unstoppable force it had been in previous years. The coalition powers seized this moment to launch a coordinated offensive against France. In early 1813, the coalition began a series of military campaigns on multiple fronts, stretching Napoleon's remaining forces thin and forcing him into a defensive position. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, fought in October 1813, was the largest confrontation of the entire Napoleonic Wars and a pivotal turning point in the conflict. Napoleon's forces faced a coalition army that numbered over 300,000 men, compared to Napoleon's 190,000. Despite his tactical brilliance, The numerical superiority of the Allies and the disintegration of his own forces led to a crushing defeat. Napoleon was forced to retreat, marking the beginning of the unraveling of his empire. The defeat at Leipzig was catastrophic, but it was only the beginning. Over the course of 1813 and into 1814, the coalition forces continued to advance through France. Napoleon, though still a master of battlefield tactics, was unable to sustain the same level of power or unity among his troops. The once great Napoleonic Empire was slowly being chipped away by the relentless advance of the Allied armies. By the time the coalition forces reached Paris in early 1814, Napoleon's situation had become untenable. The French people, exhausted by years of war, were no longer as supportive of their emperor as they had once been. Napoleon's political and military support began to erode, and after fierce fighting in the streets of Paris, the city fell to the coalition on March 30th, 1814. On April 6th, 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. The fall of Napoleon was a staggering defeat for France and a moment of triumph for the European powers who had been battling his expansionism for over a decade. The Napoleonic Empire, once the most powerful in Europe, had collapsed under the weight of Napoleon's overreach. The fall of Napoleon marked the end of an era in European history and the beginning of a new balance of power. Napoleon Bonaparte's abdication in April 1814 marked the dramatic collapse of one of history's most powerful empires. After his defeat in the Battle of Leipzig and the subsequent fall of Paris to the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon was forced into exile on the small island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. His once unquestioned authority was shattered, and the dreams of a European empire under French leadership lay in ruins. However, even in exile, Napoleon's ambition and charisma would not be silenced, and his return to power, known as the 100 Days, would be nothing short of legendary. Elba, with its picturesque landscapes and isolated position, was meant to serve as a peaceful retirement for Napoleon, though it was far from the end of his influence. Despite being stripped of his title and authority, Napoleon was given sovereignty over the island, and he took the opportunity to make reforms, improving the island's infrastructure, economy, and government. His efforts to modernize Elba, though admirable, were merely a glimpse of his far-reaching ambitions. While Napoleon was on Elba, the European powers, having exiled him, were busy reshaping the continent at the Congress of Vienna. The goal of the Congress was to restore the old European order, undoing the revolutionary changes Napoleon had implemented, and ensuring that no one ruler would again rise to dominate Europe as Napoleon had. The European powers restored the Bourbon monarchy in France, placing Louis XVIII on the throne, but the peace was fragile, and many still resented the new king's return. Despite being isolated, Napoleon's presence was never forgotten. In March 1815, just under a year after his exile, Napoleon made his dramatic escape from Elba. With a small army of followers, he returned to France, where he was greeted by soldiers and civilians alike, many of whom had once served him. His return was swift, and within a matter of weeks, he had reclaimed control of France. Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon regained the title of emperor in a moment of extraordinary political and military audacity. This brief but intense period, known as the 100 Days, saw Napoleon attempt to rebuild his empire. While the European powers quickly mobilized to confront him, he initially enjoyed significant successes, regaining much of the support he had lost in his earlier years of exile. However, Napoleon's brief resurgence was doomed to fail. The forces of the Seventh Coalition, led by Britain and Prussia, confronted him at the decisive Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. The defeat at Waterloo, after a hard-fought battle, led to Napoleon's final abdication and his exile to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. Napoleon's second exile was the end of his political and military career, but it did not mark the end of his influence. His legacy as a military genius, lawmaker, and empire builder remains a topic of fascination, debate, and study to this day. His brief return to power during the 100 Days demonstrated that even in defeat, Napoleon remained a figure of immense charisma and influence, capable of rallying a nation and shaking the foundations of Europe once again. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, stands as one of the most famous and consequential battles in history. It marked the dramatic end of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign and the final chapter of his empire-building ambitions. After his brief and bold return to power during the 100 Days, Napoleon faced an alliance of European forces determined to end his rule once and for all. The Seventh Coalition, consisting of Britain, Prussia, the Netherlands, and other allied nations, had united with the sole purpose of defeating Napoleon and ensuring that his influence in Europe was eradicated. Napoleon's forces, though smaller than the combined army of the coalition, were highly trained and experienced, with many soldiers who had previously served under him. He was also a master of battlefield tactics, and he hoped to replicate his past success. His strategy at Waterloo was based on dividing the enemy forces, defeating them in detail before they could unite. Napoleon sought to engage the British forces, led by Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army, commanded by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, before they could join forces against him. However, several factors worked against Napoleon in this final battle. First, the weather played a crucial role. Heavy rains had turned the battlefield into a quagmire, slowing Napoleon's attacks and impeding the movement of his artillery. This delay gave the Prussian forces time to march toward the battlefield and join the British forces. Napoleon's initial tactical advantage began to erode as the day wore on, and despite a fierce battle, his troops began to falter under the relentless pressure from the Allied forces. The battle saw several key phases. Early on, Napoleon's forces managed to make some breakthroughs against Wellington's troops. However, the arrival of Blücher's Prussians on the battlefield was a game-changer. The combined British and Prussian forces proved too much for Napoleon's army to handle. The French began to retreat in disarray, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to rally against the overwhelming numbers. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo marked the end of his military career. His forces were routed, and his army was forced to retreat in chaos. The impact of the loss was immediate. Napoleon's political power was effectively shattered, and his dream of re-establishing the French Empire was extinguished. He was forced to abdicate once again, and this time, there would be no. Following his defeat, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in isolation. The Battle of Waterloo was not just a military defeat. It was the death knell for the Napoleonic Empire. The Seventh Coalition celebrated their victory, and Europe began the process of restoring the balance of power that Napoleon had so dramatically disrupted. Despite his final defeat, Napoleon's legacy as one of history's greatest military tacticians and a transformative figure in European history endured. His impact on law, governance, and military strategy would echo through the centuries, and even in defeat, he remained a figure of immense historical importance. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was once again forced into exile, but this time, his fate would be far more isolated and bleak. The victors of the Seventh Coalition, determined to ensure that Napoleon would never return to power, exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, nearly 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass. This exile marked the end of his dramatic rise and fall, a life that had spanned from revolutionary general to the emperor of a vast empire, and now, to a solitary figure in his final years. St. Helena, an inhospitable island with rocky terrain and a harsh climate, was a far cry from the Mediterranean island of Elba, where Napoleon had previously been exiled. Unlike Elba, where Napoleon had retained some degree of sovereignty and had even attempted reforms, St. Helena offered no such opportunities. Napoleon's daily life was carefully controlled by the British authorities, and he was placed under constant surveillance. His movements were restricted, and he was given only a small entourage, including a few loyal servants and companions from his previous reign, such as his physician, Antoine-François de Bourrienne. Napoleon's health began to deteriorate during his years on St. Helena. Living in near isolation, far from his homeland, his once brilliant mind seemed to dull. He spent much of his time reflecting on his past, often speaking of his military campaigns and the glory of his empire. Yet, despite his growing sense of disillusionment and frustration, Napoleon remained active in his personal correspondence and dictated his memoirs, attempting to shape the narrative of his life and reign. His writings, particularly those on military strategy and governance, would later become the subject of extensive study and analysis by historians and military scholars. The conditions of Napoleon's exile were harsh. The island's climate and its remote location made it a difficult place for anyone to live, and the isolation seemed to hasten his physical decline. Napoleon began to suffer from frequent stomach pains, and his once vigorous health seemed to ebb away. In the years leading up to his death, there were speculations about the cause of his illness. Some claimed it was the result of poisoning, while others pointed to the stresses of his years in captivity. However, most historians believe that Napoleon died from stomach cancer, a disease that had also claimed the life of his father. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away at the age of 51. His death was marked by a sense of finality, but also by a deep irony. The man who had once commanded the greatest military empire in Europe, who had reshaped the political landscape of the continent, now lay buried in the farthest reaches of the British Empire, far from the glory he had once enjoyed. Napoleon's legacy, however, did not die with him. His influence continued to be felt in the realms of law, military tactics, and even in the political world. The Napoleonic Code, which he had introduced in France, would influence legal systems around the world for centuries. His military strategies remain a central subject of study, and his reign sparked significant changes in European geopolitics that would resonate long after his death. Despite the end of his empire, Napoleon Bonaparte's name would forever be synonymous with both greatness and tragedy, a man who rose from humble beginnings to change the course of history, only to fall from the pinnacle of power in a dramatic and poignant end. Napoleon Bonaparte's death in 1821 marked the end of an era, but did not signal the end of his influence. Despite his ultimate downfall and exile to the remote island of St. Helena, the legacy of Napoleon remains one of the most powerful and lasting in world history. His rule reshaped Europe, not just in terms of borders, but in the very structure of its societies, governments, and military practices. Though his empire crumbled, the changes he brought to the world, particularly through his legal and administrative reforms, would endure long after his death. One of Napoleon's most significant and lasting legacies is the Napoleonic Code. The Code Civil, as it was originally called, was a comprehensive set of laws designed to unify France under a single legal framework. It abolished feudal privileges, guaranteed property rights, and emphasized equality before the law. Napoleon's legal reforms were revolutionary in their scope and influence. The Napoleonic Code became the foundation for modern civil law systems in many countries around the world, from Europe to Latin America to parts of Africa. Even in countries that did not directly adopt the code, its principles inspired significant legal reforms. In addition to his legal impact, Napoleon's military strategies and innovations have left a profound mark on the art of warfare. Napoleon's emphasis on rapid mobilization, decisive battles, and combined arms tactics reshaped military doctrine. His ability to quickly concentrate his forces at critical points of battle and his strategic brilliance in using terrain, surprise, and speed made him a legend in military history. His tactics are still studied in military academies worldwide. The concept of the corps system, which he pioneered, became a model for modern armies, providing them with greater flexibility and autonomy on the battlefield. Napoleon's impact on European geopolitics cannot be overstated. While his empire was short-lived, the political upheaval he caused led to the Congress of Vienna and the reordering of Europe after his defeat. Many of the territorial changes Napoleon initiated, such as the redrawing of boundaries in Italy and Germany, laid the groundwork for future conflicts and the eventual unification of Italy and Germany in the 19th century. Napoleon's desire to spread revolutionary ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, though often wrapped in imperial ambitions, helped to inspire revolutionary movements across Europe and the world. Napoleon's figure has also evolved into a symbol, both of brilliance and tyranny, admired for his genius and condemned for his overreach. His life and reign continue to spark debate among historians and thinkers. Some view him as a hero who brought order to a continent ravaged by revolution, while others see him as a power-hungry despot whose thirst for conquest led to unnecessary suffering and death. His rise and fall remain a dramatic tale of ambition, glory, and the complexities of human nature. Napoleon's legacy is, therefore, not just in what he achieved, but also in the lessons his story provides about power, leadership, and the limits of ambition. His name continues to be remembered as a figure who left an indelible mark on history, for better or for worse. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire may have collapsed, but his influence on the course of European and world history has been undeniable and enduring. The political, legal, and military systems he put in place laid the groundwork for modern Europe, transforming not just France, but much of the continent. Napoleon's impact transcended his time, and many of the changes he set in motion are still felt today, across Europe and beyond. One of Napoleon's most far-reaching influences was in the realm of political thought. The principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, were embodied in his reign, though his method of enforcing these ideals often contradicted the revolutionary spirit. While Napoleon reintroduced monarchic authority, his reforms carried forward the idea that governance should be based on rational principles rather than hereditary privilege. His meritocracy, where individuals rose to power based on talent and ability rather than birthright, left a lasting mark on political systems in both Europe and the Americas. Even though Napoleon's empire was short-lived, the ideals of equality before the law and social mobility continued to inspire reform movements across the globe. Napoleon's military innovations also paved the way for modern warfare. His emphasis on centralized command, rapid troop movements, and strategic flexibility made him a revolutionary figure in military strategy. The core system that he created was a model of organizational efficiency, allowing troops to operate independently but remain coordinated under a central command. This approach would later influence the armies of other nations and military leaders, including World War I commanders. Napoleon's techniques in artillery, combined arms, and battlefield maneuvering are still taught in military academies worldwide as part of the canon of classic military strategy. In addition to his military innovations, Napoleon's administrative reforms reshaped France and much of Europe. His establishment of the centralized state in France, with its strong bureaucracy and efficient government, served as a model for later European rulers. The Napoleonic Code not only redefined civil law in France, but also influenced legal systems in countries across Europe, the Americas, and even parts of Asia. Its focus on equality, property rights, and legal clarity continues to be foundational in modern legal frameworks. Countries like Italy, Germany, and Spain adopted versions of the code, and it was even adopted in places like Japan during its Meiji Restoration. Napoleon's influence on nationalism also cannot be overlooked. While his empire was based on the idea of imperial control, the spread of his reforms and the ideas of the French Revolution fostered a sense of national identity in the territories he conquered. The Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent Congress of Vienna marked the beginning of the modern nation-state system, where the idea of self-determination for people groups took root. The aspirations for national unity, particularly in Italy and Germany, would later lead to their unification in the 19th century. Though Napoleon's empire fell, his legacy shaped the evolution of European and global politics, law, and military strategy for centuries. His complex and controversial legacy continues to fascinate and provoke debate, but his undeniable contributions to the shaping of the modern world remain his most lasting achievement. By the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte's empire stood at the height of its power, stretching from Spain to the borders of Russia. Yet, cracks in the fragile peace with Russia began to appear, and the relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had deteriorated. Russia's refusal to adhere fully to the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain, was one of the primary causes of tension. The continental system was designed to weaken Britain by cutting off European trade, but Russia, due to its economic dependence on trade with Britain, began to ignore the blockade, resuming commercial relations with the British. Napoleon, deeply invested in the success of the continental system, could not afford this defiance. The Tsar's actions were not only a direct challenge to Napoleon's authority, but also a sign that Russia, the largest and most powerful state in Europe after France, was slipping out of his grasp. Napoleon had always seen Russia as an important ally, but as the political and economic divide between the two empires widened, Napoleon's fears of a two-front war grew. He believed that he could not let Russia's defiance continue without consequences. Therefore, in the spring of 1812, Napoleon began planning an invasion of Russia, hoping that a swift and decisive victory would force Tsar Alexander to submit to French authority. There were strategic reasons for the invasion as well. Napoleon had already expanded his empire to the east, and Russia was the final holdout. A successful campaign against Russia would ensure French dominance over all of Europe, leaving Britain isolated. Napoleon also believed that forcing Russia to comply with the continental system would cripple Britain's economy, thus fulfilling one of his greatest ambitions, bringing Britain to its knees without having to directly engage in a naval battle. However, the decision to invade Russia was not solely based on military strategy. It was also driven by Napoleon's growing sense of invincibility. After his successes in Europe, including the conquest of Spain, the defeat of Prussia, and the consolidation of his empire, Napoleon believed that his army was unbeatable. He underestimated the vastness of Russia, the harshness of its climate, and the resilience of the Russian people. While he had conquered much of Europe with relative ease, Russia would prove to be a vastly different adversary. By June 1812, Napoleon had gathered one of the largest military forces ever assembled, the Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, including soldiers from all over Europe, including French, Polish, Italian, German, and Austrian troops. Napoleon believed that such an enormous force would be more than sufficient to crush any Russian resistance. What he failed to account for was the vastness of the Russian terrain, the severe winter conditions, and the Russian strategy of retreat, which would lead to a disaster unlike anything he had faced before. The stage was set for one of Napoleon's most fateful and disastrous campaigns, the invasion of Russia, which would ultimately mark the beginning of the decline of the Napoleonic Empire. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte set his massive invasion of Russia into motion, marking the beginning of one of the most ambitious and ill-fated campaigns in military history. Napoleon, now at the peak of his power, believed his Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, would easily overwhelm the Russian forces. The army was a multinational force, consisting of French soldiers, Austrians, Italians, Poles, and soldiers from other allied states. It was the largest military force ever assembled in Europe at the time, and Napoleon's confidence in his ability to achieve a quick victory was unwavering. Napoleon's strategic goal was clear: march deep into Russian territory, crush the Russian army in a decisive battle, and force Tsar Alexander I to negotiate a peace settlement that would bring Russia fully under Napoleon's control. The French plan was to use their overwhelming numbers and superior training to engage the Russian forces in a major battle. Napoleon anticipated that the Russian army, once defeated, would be forced to accept his terms, re-enter the continental system, and end their defiance of France. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, as the Grande Armée crossed the Neman River, entering Russian territory. From the start, Napoleon faced logistical challenges that would haunt him throughout the campaign. The Russian army, under Tsar Alexander's command, retreated deep into their vast homeland, using the strategy of scorched earth. Rather than engage in direct combat, the Russian forces systematically withdrew, burning villages, destroying crops, and poisoning wells as they went. This strategy, designed to deprive Napoleon's army of supplies and force them into the Russian interior, would be devastatingly effective. Despite the difficulties, Napoleon pressed on, pursuing the Russian forces across vast stretches of barren land. The French army was now stretched thin, far from their supply lines, and facing harsh summer heat, frequent rain, and growing shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Despite the immense size of the army, Napoleon's forces began to suffer from fatigue, disease, and hunger. These initial hardships foreshadowed the disaster to come, but Napoleon remained confident that once he forced a decisive battle, the Russian army would break and the Tsar would come to terms. The Russian forces, under Tsar Alexander, adopted a strategy of retreating further into Russia's endless expanses, effectively avoiding any engagement in a pitched battle. With each day that passed, Napoleon's men grew weaker, exhausted from the grueling march, and morale began to deteriorate. The further they advanced, the more the supply situation became dire. Still, Napoleon pressed forward, determined to force a confrontation. The first major clash between the two forces occurred at the Battle of Smolensk in August 1812, but it was not the decisive victory Napoleon had hoped for. The Russians, though heavily outnumbered, managed to retreat again, leaving Napoleon with a burnt city and little in the way of supplies. It was becoming clear to Napoleon that this campaign would not be the quick victory he had anticipated, and the challenges of an extended march through the Russian wilderness were starting to take their toll. By September 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée had made its way deep into Russia, but the road to victory seemed ever more elusive. After months of pursuit, the Russian army, under the command of Tsar Alexander I, finally made its stand at Borodino, just 70 miles west of Moscow. The battle, which took place on September 5–7, 1812, was one of the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars, with heavy casualties on both sides. It would prove to be a pivotal moment in Napoleon's campaign, offering him a tactical victory, but at an unbearable cost. Napoleon's forces, although numerically superior, faced stiff resistance from the Russian army, which had entrenched itself in strong positions. The battle raged for hours, with French forces charging Russian positions time and again, only to be repelled by determined Russian defenders. Napoleon, who was known for his aggressive and decisive tactics, struggled to break through the Russian defenses. Despite his army's successes in pushing the Russians back, the battle was indecisive. Both sides suffered tremendous losses, with around 30,000 French soldiers and 45,000 Russians killed or wounded. Despite technically winning the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon could not claim the decisive victory he had hoped for. The Russian army, although battered, was not broken. Tsar Alexander, adhering to his strategy of retreating deeper into the Russian heartland, withdrew once again, refusing to give Napoleon the victory he needed. Napoleon's army, exhausted from the grueling march and the costly battle, pressed on toward Moscow, believing that the capture of the Russian capital would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate a peace settlement. As Napoleon's forces advanced toward Moscow, they faced worsening conditions. The supply lines were overstretched, and the French army began to suffer from hunger, fatigue, and disease. The further they marched into Russia, the more isolated they became. The Russian strategy of scorched earth, burning villages, crops, and resources in their wake, left Napoleon's army with no shelter, food, or supplies. The weather, which had been mercilessly hot during the summer, was now beginning to turn, and the winter cold was creeping in. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon and his army finally reached Moscow, the spiritual and political heart of Russia. But what awaited them was not the grand victory Napoleon had expected. Moscow, once a bustling city, had been largely abandoned by its inhabitants and was in flames. The Russian people had set fire to their own city, depriving Napoleon's army of supplies and shelter. Despite occupying the city, Napoleon's forces were left without the resources needed to sustain them. Napoleon, having failed to decisively defeat the Russian army and now stranded in a burning city with a demoralized army, faced a dire decision. His invasion, which had initially seemed like a grand and unstoppable force, was faltering. The Russian winter was fast approaching, and with no peace settlement in sight, the time had come for Napoleon to make a difficult choice. The Russian campaign, once seen as his path to ultimate victory, was now spiraling toward disaster. Napoleon Bonaparte's entry into Moscow in September 1812 was meant to be the culmination of his invasion of Russia. The capture of the Russian capital was expected to force Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table, bringing the Russian Empire to its knees and forcing it to accept the terms of the continental system. But what awaited Napoleon and his troops in Moscow was far from a triumphant victory. Instead of the surrendered Russian army or the peace he sought, he was greeted with a city in flames. As Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, he found that much of the city had been set ablaze. The Russian people, under orders from the Russian authorities, had evacuated the city and set fire to their homes, businesses, and public buildings in a final act of defiance. The flames that consumed Moscow left Napoleon's army with no shelter, food, or resources. The Russian army had once again outmaneuvered him, not with military might, but with a scorched-earth strategy that denied the French forces any means of sustaining their campaign. Napoleon's occupation of Moscow was symbolic in nature, as the city offered little strategic value without supplies or civilian infrastructure. Napoleon had hoped that by capturing Moscow, the Russian government would be forced to capitulate. But with the Tsar refusing to negotiate and no tangible victory to present, Napoleon found himself in a difficult position. His forces, already stretched thin, were becoming increasingly demoralized and fatigued. The Russian winter loomed on the horizon, and Napoleon's army was ill-prepared to face the harsh conditions of the Russian climate. Napoleon, ever the master tactician, attempted to use the occupation of Moscow to pressure the Russians into peace talks, but his demands went unanswered. For weeks, Napoleon waited in the burning city, hoping for a response from Tsar Alexander, but none came. His once immense army, now spread thin, was unable to make further progress, and the lack of supplies and shelter was taking a toll on the soldiers. Their morale, already low after months of hardship, began to plummet. The situation grew more desperate as time passed. With no food, inadequate shelter, and the looming threat of the Russian winter, Napoleon faced a grim reality. His grand plan to force a quick victory had turned into an insurmountable disaster. The longer he stayed in Moscow, the more his army suffered. By early October, Napoleon was forced to make the difficult decision to retreat. The decision to retreat marked a dramatic turning point in the Russian campaign. Napoleon, once known for his boldness and audacity, now found himself in an untenable position, with his forces stretched to the breaking point. The path that had seemed so certain just a few months earlier was now leading directly toward disaster. The Russian campaign, which had begun with such promise, was rapidly becoming a catastrophic failure. The burning of Moscow was not just the loss of a city. It was the symbolic death of Napoleon's ambitions in Russia. As the last hopes of a negotiated peace vanished with the continued Russian refusal to engage, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself at crossroads. Having occupied the city of Moscow for over a month, and with the Russian winter fast approaching, it became clear that the initial strategy of quick conquest had failed. The Grande Armée, now severely weakened by months of fighting, exhaustion, and the harsh conditions of the Russian countryside, was facing an insurmountable challenge: a retreat from Moscow. Napoleon, although known for his boldness, was left with little choice but to order the retreat of his army from the city in October 1812. The decision was a critical one, and its consequences would mark the beginning of a catastrophic series of events that would devastate Napoleon's forces and cripple his empire. With no meaningful victory to claim and the failure of his occupation strategy in Moscow, Napoleon set his sights on returning to France, hoping that his army could survive the long journey back. But the retreat from Moscow quickly descended into a nightmare. The harsh Russian winter, which had been a constant threat throughout the campaign, now turned from a looming challenge into an immediate, deadly reality. As the temperature dropped, the once mighty Grande Armée, battered and exhausted, found itself ill-prepared for the severe cold and the ruthless conditions of the Russian steppe. The soldiers, many of them suffering from frostbite, hunger, and disease, began to die in alarming numbers. The Russian army, which had retreated further into the interior, now began to harass Napoleon's retreating forces. Cossack raiders and Russian forces attacked the French rear and flanks, launching relentless strikes that cut off the French supply lines. Napoleon's army was in full retreat, but it was not a dignified retreat. It was a disorganized, chaotic exodus across a vast and hostile landscape. Napoleon had to make difficult decisions, trying to maintain order as the Grande Armée crumbled under the weight of its own mismanagement and the unrelenting Russian strategy of attrition. The French soldiers, demoralized and starving, found themselves retreating through a scorched and barren land, with little shelter and no resources. The Russian army's strategy of scorched earth, burning villages, poisoning wells, and destroying crops had deprived Napoleon's army of any means of sustenance. As the weather worsened, the roads became impassable, and the situation for the retreating French became increasingly dire. Napoleon, who had once been known for his brilliant military strategy, now found himself helpless against the elements and the growing collapse of his army. By December, the Grande Armée was a shadow of its former self, reduced to a fraction of its original numbers. Disease, hunger, cold, and Russian attacks had taken their toll. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow had turned into an overwhelming disaster, one that would go down in history as one of the greatest military blunders of all time. By November 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée had suffered irreparable losses during its brutal retreat from Moscow. What had once been the most formidable military force in Europe was now a fragmented, starving, and demoralized shell of its former self. As the temperature plummeted, the conditions worsened, and the men of the Grande Armée, already on the brink of collapse, found themselves in a fight for survival against both the Russian elements and their own deteriorating resources. The Russian winter had set in, and the French soldiers, who had been ill-prepared for such harsh conditions, began to succumb in droves. Frostbite, disease, and exhaustion claimed the lives of thousands, and those who survived were too weak to continue their march. Many of the soldiers had no shoes, and their clothes had been worn through after months of brutal campaigning. The remnants of Napoleon's army were forced to march through knee-deep snow, often without food or shelter. The longer the retreat lasted, the fewer soldiers remained in any condition to fight. Starving men were left to die in the snow, while others were picked off by Russian skirmishers and Cossack raids. Napoleon, once celebrated for his military genius, found himself powerless to stop the collapse of his forces. He had hoped to regroup and salvage what was left of his army, but every attempt to maintain order failed. The vastness of the Russian terrain had already stretched his army thin, and with each passing day, more soldiers fell behind. Supplies were exhausted, and the soldiers had no choice but to scavenge from the land, often fighting over scraps of food. The heavy artillery, wagons, and even horses had been abandoned along the route, further slowing the retreat. As the French forces reached the Berezina River in late November, Napoleon faced one of his final opportunities to salvage the remnants of his army. The Battle of the Berezina was one of the last standalone battles of the campaign, where Napoleon's forces attempted to cross the frozen river to escape further Russian attacks. Though Napoleon managed to organize a temporary crossing and escape, the battle resulted in more casualties, and the river crossing itself was fraught with chaos. The battle and the retreat were a clear sign that the Grande Armée, which had once been the epitome of Napoleon's might, was now irrevocably shattered. By the end of the retreat, Napoleon had lost around 500,000 soldiers. Only a fraction of the original force managed to return to France. The devastation was so complete that it became clear to everyone, including Napoleon himself, that the campaign had been an unmitigated disaster. The retreat from Russia marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. His military dominance was shattered, and Europe began to rise against him. By the time Napoleon's shattered army staggered back into France in early 1813, the full scale of the disaster in Russia had become undeniable. The Grande Armée, once a symbol of France's military supremacy, had been reduced to a broken, demoralized force, devastated by the harsh Russian winter, disease, and constant Russian attacks. The colossal failure of the invasion had far-reaching consequences for Napoleon's empire, both militarily and politically. Napoleon, however, was not a man to surrender easily. Even in the face of overwhelming defeat, he attempted to salvage what he could of his remaining forces. Upon his return to Paris, Napoleon immediately began rebuilding his army, calling on his allies, and even conscripting new soldiers to replenish the ranks. Yet, his empire was now deeply fractured. The Sixth Coalition, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Sweden, and other European nations, had been watching his defeat with growing satisfaction, and they quickly saw their opportunity to bring an end to Napoleon's rule. Despite the monumental losses, Napoleon's charisma and leadership allowed him to raise another army, though it was far weaker and less experienced than his previous forces. But this new army faced an uphill battle. The political landscape in Europe was changing rapidly, and many of the territories once allied with France began to turn against Napoleon. In Germany, Austria, and Sweden, Nationalist movements began to swell, and former allies, disillusioned by Napoleon's failure, began to openly support the coalition. Napoleon's once ironclad control over much of Europe was now slipping away. In the spring of 1813, the coalition forces launched their offensive in a bid to capitalize on the weaknesses of the French Empire. Napoleon was forced to take immediate action. The resulting War of the Sixth Coalition saw the French once again fighting for their survival. Napoleon, however, was a strategic genius, and though his army was smaller and fatigued, he managed to score a few victories. The Battle of Dresden in August 1813 was one such victory, where Napoleon's forces pushed back the advancing coalition troops, but these moments of triumph were fleeting and insufficient to turn the tide. Meanwhile, the French public, once loyal to Napoleon and inspired by his earlier successes, grew increasingly frustrated with the constant wars and mounting casualties. The devastation of the Russian campaign, coupled with the mounting losses in the War of the Sixth Coalition, began to erode Napoleon's support at home. Even some of his marshals and senior officers began to question his leadership. Napoleon's once formidable empire, already weakened by the Russian disaster, was crumbling under the combined weight of war, rebellion, and international pressure. In 1814, after several more defeats, the French capital, Paris, was finally captured by the coalition forces. Napoleon, realizing the inevitable, was forced to abdicate for the second time on April 6, 1814. The fall of Paris marked the end of Napoleon's reign as emperor. The victorious Allies exiled him to the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, where he would be given sovereignty in a token of French recognition. The emperor who had once ruled over a vast European empire was now a prisoner in exile, his power broken and his empire dismantled. Napoleon Bonaparte's abdication on April 6, 1814, marked the end of a dazzling era of military dominance and empire building. After a disastrous retreat from Russia, a string of defeats in the War of the Sixth Coalition, and the capture of Paris by the Allied forces, Napoleon's reign came to an abrupt and ignoble conclusion. Once the ruler of most of Europe, he was now exiled to the island of Elba, a small, Mediterranean island just off the coast of Italy, where he would spend the next few years in relative isolation. Elba, though relatively close to France, was a far cry from the grandeur and power that Napoleon had once enjoyed. The terms of his exile were negotiated by the victors of the Sixth Coalition, particularly the British and the Russians, who sought to ensure that Napoleon would never again rise to power. Napoleon was granted sovereignty over Elba, with control over its government and military, but the island was small and strategically insignificant, far from the vast empire he had once commanded. Despite the limitations of his exile, Napoleon was not idle. Even on Elba, he sought to reform and improve the island, just as he had done during his brief stay on Corsica before his rise to power. He implemented a range of reforms, including modernizing the island's infrastructure, revamping its military, and improving the local economy. Napoleon's charisma and leadership were still evident, and he gained the loyalty of many of the island's inhabitants, even while his thoughts were never far from his former empire. Yet, Napoleon's exile was never meant to be a permanent solution. The story of Napoleon's return to power is one of the most remarkable in history. Even in exile, Napoleon remained a figure of immense influence, and he never truly accepted his fate as a prisoner. In France, his supporters, known as the Bonapartists, were still loyal to him, and many in the French military and government were unhappy with the rule of Louis XVIII, the Bourbon monarch who had been restored to the throne after Napoleon's abdication. Meanwhile, in Europe, Napoleon's military genius was still admired. His enemies had been unable to crush his influence completely, and the political instability in France and across Europe began to create the perfect storm for his return. The political situation in France was unstable, the monarchy was unpopular, and many French citizens and soldiers were disillusioned with the monarchy's return to power. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, saw this as his chance. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, returning to France with a small group of loyal followers. His dramatic return, known as the 100 Days, would ignite a final period of Napoleon's rule. The excitement and hope that Napoleon's return sparked in France was palpable, as thousands of soldiers and citizens rallied to his cause, eager to restore him to power. Napoleon Bonaparte's escape from Elba in February 1815 marked the beginning of the most dramatic comeback in history. His return to France, after less than a year in exile, was a bold act that shook Europe and redefined his legacy. The event, known as the 100 Days, was Napoleon's final attempt to reclaim his empire and restore his dominance over Europe, but it would ultimately be short-lived and end in disaster. Napoleon's return to France was facilitated by growing discontent with the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII. While Napoleon was exiled to Elba, the restored Bourbon king had struggled to gain the support of the French people. Many were disillusioned with the monarchy, which had failed to bring lasting peace or stability to France after the upheaval of the Revolution and Napoleon's reign. The return of the monarchy had not erased the memory of Napoleon's strong leadership, and many soldiers, government officials, and citizens still held loyalty to him. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed in Caen, southern France, with a small contingent of followers. His journey back was swift and decisive, and the French army, seeing the former emperor's return, began to rally behind him. As he marched toward Paris, more and more soldiers and townsfolk joined his cause. The Bourbon government, caught off guard, sent troops to confront him, but the loyalty of Napoleon's former soldiers proved stronger. When the French army faced Napoleon's forces near Grenoble, the royal troops, instead of fighting, defected to Napoleon's side, swelling his ranks. By March 20, 1815, Napoleon had regained control of Paris. The 100 Days had begun, and Napoleon was back in power. He quickly restored his imperial government, issuing reforms and calling for a new constitution. His return was greeted with widespread enthusiasm in some quarters, but also anxiety in others. The European powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, viewed Napoleon's return as a direct threat to the delicate peace that had been negotiated after his first exile, and they quickly mobilized their forces to crush him once again. Napoleon, determined to maintain his regained power, prepared for war. He knew that his window for success was small, and his army, though strengthened by defectors and loyalists, was still not the force it had been in its prime. In June 1815, the pivotal Battle of Waterloo would determine the fate of Napoleon's reign once and for all. Napoleon, confident in his military prowess, marched to meet the Allied forces led by the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The outcome of that battle would seal the fate of the Napoleonic Empire and bring an end to the 100 Days. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, marked the dramatic and final chapter in Napoleon Bonaparte's tumultuous reign. After his return from Elba during the 100 Days, Napoleon sought to reclaim his empire and secure his legacy once again. However, his military genius, which had served him so well in the past, was no match for the combined might of Europe's greatest powers, who had united to stop him once and for all. The battle took place near the village of Waterloo, in present-day Belgium, and pitted Napoleon's French forces against the allied armies of Britain, led by the Duke of Wellington, and Prussia, under the command of Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon's plan was to strike decisively and defeat each army separately before they could join forces, but the execution of his strategy would not go according to plan. Napoleon's army, though smaller than the Allied forces, was still formidable, with around 73,000 soldiers compared to the combined Allied force of approximately 120,000. The battlefield itself was muddy from heavy rain the night before, which slowed down Napoleon's attacks and gave his enemies precious time to regroup. His artillery, one of his key strengths, was hampered by the conditions, reducing its effectiveness during the battle. The battle began in the morning with Napoleon's forces launching a series of attacks on the British lines. Napoleon hoped that a strong offensive against Wellington's troops would break the enemy's resolve, but Wellington's forces held firm. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Despite early success, Napoleon's forces were unable to gain a decisive advantage, and the arrival of Prussian reinforcements under Blücher turned the tide against the French. Napoleon's decision to delay key attacks, such as the assault on Wellington's left flank, proved costly. By the late afternoon, the Prussian forces had arrived on the battlefield, and the French were overwhelmed. Blücher's army, along with Wellington's steadfast defense, broke through the French lines, and Napoleon's forces began to disintegrate. By evening, it was clear that the French had lost. Napoleon, recognizing that the battle was lost, fled the field, and his hopes of restoring his empire were shattered. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of his reign as Emperor of France. His forces were decimated, and his dream of re-establishing a French-dominated Europe was dashed. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second time, and this time, there would be no return. Following his defeat, Napoleon was captured and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. His final defeat at Waterloo sealed his legacy, not as the emperor who conquered much of Europe, but as the man whose ambition ultimately led to his downfall. After nearly a year in exile on the small island of Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte's return to France in 1815 would set the stage for one of the most dramatic chapters in European history. The events that unfolded during the 100 Days marked the final act of Napoleon's reign, culminating in the Battle of Waterloo. But before he could face his ultimate defeat, Napoleon's escape from Elba was the catalyst that would reignite his empire and challenge the political order of Europe. The seeds of Napoleon's return were sown by growing discontent in France with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVIII, who had been placed on the throne after Napoleon's first abdication, struggled to gain the loyalty of the French people. His reign was marked by political instability, economic difficulties, and the growing dissatisfaction of the French soldiers and citizens who remembered the stability and strength of Napoleon's leadership. The Bourbon monarchy, seen by many as a return to the old aristocratic order, failed to meet the expectations of the nation, and Napoleon's name still resonated strongly with a large portion of the population. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, took advantage of this unrest. In February 1815, he escaped from Elba with a small group of loyal followers. The conditions for his escape were surprisingly favorable. The island of Elba, though under Napoleon's nominal control, was situated only a short distance from the French mainland, and Napoleon's personal charisma and influence were enough to draw a group of soldiers to his cause. His supporters in France had already been preparing for his return, quietly working behind the scenes to facilitate his return to power. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed in the south of France, near Caen, with around 1,000 men. As he made his way toward Paris, his presence grew increasingly known, and the French people, still loyal to him, began to rally to his cause. Napoleon's arrival was met with enthusiastic support, especially from soldiers and civilians who were disillusioned by the Bourbon monarchy. Local military commanders, some of whom had served under him during his earlier campaigns, defected to his side, swelling his forces as he marched toward Paris. The march to Paris was swift, and with each passing day, more and more soldiers and citizens rallied to Napoleon's side. The royal forces, sent by Louis XVIII to confront him, were quickly disbanded as they too chose to join Napoleon rather than oppose him. By March 20th, 1815, just a few weeks after his landing, Napoleon had regained control of the French capital. Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon was once again Emperor of the French. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon Bonaparte's dramatic return to power in March 1815 marked the beginning of the 100 Days, a period of intense political upheaval, military preparation, and renewed conflict. Though his return to France was greeted with enthusiasm by many who had longed for his leadership, Napoleon's position was far from secure. The political landscape had shifted significantly since his first abdication, and he faced numerous challenges as he sought to rebuild his empire and reassert French dominance in Europe. Once Napoleon reclaimed Paris and took the throne again, he wasted no time in trying to stabilize the situation. The French people, disillusioned by the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII, welcomed Napoleon back with open arms. However, his return was not without opposition. Louis XVIII had fled the country, but many of the royalists still loyal to the Bourbon family remained. Additionally, many of Napoleon's former enemies, who had once banded together to defeat him, were now preparing for his inevitable confrontation with the coalition forces. Napoleon's first priority was to rebuild the military. The French army, though not completely destroyed, had been severely weakened after years of war. The remnants of Napoleon's forces had suffered significant losses during the Russian campaign and the War of the Sixth Coalition, and many soldiers had deserted or been disbanded. Napoleon quickly reformed the army, bringing back old soldiers and recruiting new ones. He was able to gather a significant force, though it was not as powerful as his earlier armies. At the same time, Napoleon worked to shore up his political position. He made efforts to reassure the French people that his return would not mean the continuation of the endless wars that had characterized his rule. He promised reforms and a more stable government, aligning himself with the liberal elements of society to gain support. Napoleon's return, though still marked by a desire for power, was framed as a means to stabilize France and restore it to its former glory. However, the situation was rapidly changing across Europe. The Allied powers, including Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, viewed Napoleon's return as a direct threat to the peace they had established following his first abdication. The Congress of Vienna, which had been working to restore order and redraw the borders of Europe, had to face a new crisis. Napoleon's return ignited the fears of a resurgence of his empire and an unraveling of the delicate balance of power they had worked to establish. As Napoleon quickly rebuilt his military and prepared for the inevitable war, he understood that time was against him. The European powers were united in their determination to destroy his ambitions once and for all. Napoleon, fully aware of the risks, knew that the upcoming confrontation would define his legacy once and for all. Napoleon Bonaparte's return to power in March 1815 sparked immediate alarm throughout Europe. The Allied powers, Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, who had worked together to defeat Napoleon and restore the old order after his first abdication, quickly recognized that their peace would not last. Napoleon's dramatic re-entry into the political scene signaled the collapse of the European stability they had worked so hard to create. The powers who had celebrated his exile were now unified in their determination to prevent a second rise of the Napoleonic Empire. Upon his return to France, Napoleon moved swiftly to strengthen his position both politically and militarily. He restructured the French army, bringing back many of the veterans who had fought under him during his earlier conquests. He promised reforms and a more stable government, hoping to ensure the loyalty of both the military and the people. Napoleon also made efforts to pacify the royalists, offering amnesty to those who had supported the Bourbon monarchy in an attempt to prevent internal division within France. However, Napoleon's renewed power would not be unchallenged for long. As soon as he had regained control of France, the Allied powers began to prepare for war. The Seventh Coalition, formed to face Napoleon's resurgence, was led by Great Britain and Prussia, with Russia and Austria joining the ranks. A unified European front began to take shape, with the aim of crushing Napoleon before he could build up sufficient strength. Napoleon, aware of the growing threat, began to act quickly. The Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, was stationed in Belgium with British forces, while Prussia's army, led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, positioned itself along the Rhine. Napoleon knew that he could not afford to wait for the coalition to fully mobilize and unite against him. His only chance for victory lay in striking first and dividing the forces of the Allied powers. In June 1815, Napoleon launched his invasion of the Low Countries with the intent of defeating the British and Prussian armies before they could combine their forces. His strategy relied on the speed and efficiency of his army, hoping to break the coalition's resolve through rapid, decisive battles. His initial success in splitting the forces of Wellington and Blücher seemed promising, but the stakes could not have been higher. Napoleon had gambled everything on this campaign, knowing that any failure would lead to the collapse of his Second Empire. As Napoleon marched toward Waterloo, his army brimming with confidence from its recent victories, he faced an uncertain future. The outcome of the coming battle would determine the fate of his reign and, more importantly, the future of France and Europe. The stage was set for the final showdown. Napoleon Bonaparte had launched his campaign during the 100 Days with a clear objective: to defeat the British and Prussian forces separately before they could join forces. His target was Waterloo, a crucial crossroads in Belgium where the Allied armies of the Duke of Wellington, British, and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, Prussian, had gathered. Napoleon's military brilliance, honed over years of successful campaigns, will be put to the test in what would become one of the most iconic battles in history. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, was a culmination of Napoleon's ambitions to reclaim his empire. His strategy was bold and aggressive, aimed at disrupting the unity of the Allied forces. He understood that if he could separate Wellington's British forces from Blücher's Prussian troops, he could engage each army individually and destroy them before they could unite. On the morning of June 18th, Napoleon began his attack with the hope of achieving a quick and decisive victory. His forces, approximately 73,000 strong, were facing off against a combined force of about 118,000 soldiers from the British-led coalition. The terrain at Waterloo was not ideal for large-scale maneuvering, with thick mud from recent rain turning the battlefield into a quagmire. Despite this, Napoleon pushed forward with his plan, beginning with a series of assaults aimed at Wellington's left flank. Napoleon's primary objective in the opening stages of the battle was to break through Wellington's defenses and create a wedge between the British and their allies. To achieve this, he employed his trusted tactics of artillery bombardment, combined with infantry assaults. His famed artillery, though hampered by the wet conditions, managed to bombard the British positions relentlessly. Napoleon hoped that Wellington's army, stretched thin across a defensive line, would break under the pressure of these heavy assaults. However, Wellington's forces held firm. The British line, reinforced by Dutch and Belgian troops, was strong and well-coordinated, making it difficult for Napoleon to make a decisive breakthrough. Despite several hours of intense fighting, Napoleon was unable to penetrate the center of Wellington's position, and his strategy to divide the British and Prussian forces was not going according to plan. As the battle progressed, Napoleon's sense of urgency grew. He knew that Blücher's Prussian army was marching toward the battlefield and could potentially tip the scales against him. Napoleon needed to break Wellington's forces quickly or risk being caught between two powerful armies. But even as Napoleon pressed forward, he was beginning to realize that his initial advantage in this battle was slipping away. By the late afternoon of June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo had reached a critical juncture. Napoleon Bonaparte, after hours of intense fighting, had failed to break through the lines of the Duke of Wellington's British-led forces. While Napoleon's artillery had caused significant casualties and his infantry had engaged in repeated attacks, Wellington's troops remained resilient. Napoleon's hope to divide and conquer Wellington's forces by striking first was beginning to falter, and he now had to contend with a new, looming threat: the arrival of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. From early in the battle, Napoleon had been aware that Blücher's army was marching to join Wellington. He had hoped to defeat the British quickly and decisively before Blücher's Prussians could arrive and unite with them. Yet, as the day wore on, it became clear that the Prussian forces were closing in on the battlefield. Napoleon's forces were already stretched thin, and any additional pressure from Blücher would likely spell disaster for the French. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon's worst fears were realized. The Prussian army, numbering around 50,000 soldiers, had reached the battlefield. Blücher, despite the fatigue of his long march, wasted no time in throwing his forces into the fray. The Prussians began their attack on Napoleon's right flank, effectively surrounding his army and cutting off his escape route. The arrival of the Prussian forces shifted the balance of power on the battlefield, and Napoleon's initial advantage rapidly turned into a serious disadvantage. Napoleon had hoped to end the battle before Blücher's arrival, but now he faced a two-front conflict, with the British forces holding their ground and the Prussians attacking from the east. His earlier attempts to break Wellington's forces had already taken a heavy toll, and now, with the Prussians in the mix, the French were being pushed back on both sides. Napoleon attempted to rally his troops and organize a counteroffensive, but the morale of his soldiers had begun to waver. Wellington, who had been waiting for the Prussians to arrive all day, seized the opportunity to launch a decisive counterattack against Napoleon's exhausted troops. As the Prussian forces arrived in full force, the French found themselves surrounded, and their lines began to crumble under the weight of the combined British and Prussian onslaught. Napoleon's once invincible army, worn out by the prolonged battle and harassed by two enemy forces, was now in full retreat. The battle that had started with so much promise for Napoleon had slipped into disaster. The tide had turned decisively. By the late afternoon of June 18, 1815, The Battle of Waterloo had become a desperate struggle for Napoleon Bonaparte and his army. After hours of intense fighting and several unsuccessful attacks on Wellington's British-led forces, the arrival of Prussian reinforcements under Blücher had turned the tide decisively in favor of the Seventh Coalition. Napoleon, who had been counting on defeating Wellington before the Prussians could intervene, now found himself overwhelmed by the combined might of the British and Prussian forces. As Napoleon's army began to crumble, it became clear that the French forces were facing total defeat. The once proud Grande Armée, which had once swept across Europe, was now disintegrating on the battlefield. Napoleon, despite his strategic genius, could not overcome the crushing weight of the two armies attacking from different directions. His soldiers, exhausted from days of fighting and demoralized by the arrival of the Prussians, began to break ranks and retreat. Napoleon attempted to rally his forces one last time, ordering a final charge, but the momentum had shifted irreparably. His Imperial Guard, the elite of his army, was thrown into the fray in a desperate attempt to break the British lines. Yet, even the Guard's reputation for invincibility could not save Napoleon's army. As the Guard advanced toward Wellington's position, they were met with fierce resistance, and the once formidable French forces were repelled. The sight of the Guard faltering marked the final collapse of Napoleon's military power. The French army, unable to hold its ground, began a full-scale retreat. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of musket fire and cannon blasts, now echoed with the cries of soldiers fleeing in disarray. Wellington's forces, reinforced by the Prussians, relentlessly pursued the retreating French troops. The French soldiers, overwhelmed and scattered, were unable to organize any coherent defense, and the remnants of Napoleon's army were soon routed. As the sun set on the battlefield, Napoleon's defeat was complete. The Battle of Waterloo had ended in a crushing victory for the Allied forces, and Napoleon's reign had come to an abrupt and definitive end. His dreams of restoring the Napoleonic Empire were shattered, and his military career, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now in ruins. Napoleon, realizing the magnitude of his defeat, fled the battlefield. His return to Paris would soon be followed by his second abdication, marking the final fall of his empire. The 100 Days, which had begun with such hope, had ended in disaster for Napoleon and France. After his devastating defeat at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself facing the end of his reign for the second time. His hopes of restoring his empire had evaporated, and the mighty emperor who had once ruled over much of Europe was now a defeated fugitive. In the wake of his collapse, Napoleon was forced to abdicate once again, this time for good. His second abdication, on June 22, 1815, marked the beginning of the final chapter of his life, a period of isolation, imprisonment, and reflection on an empire that had crumbled beneath the weight of his ambition. Napoleon, fully aware of the consequences of his defeat, sought to escape from the chaos that had consumed France. The Bourbon monarchy, restored to power under Louis XVIII, was eager to rid itself of the emperor who had so thoroughly reshaped the country. Napoleon's situation was dire. Not only had he lost his empire, but the allies who had once fought against him now sought to punish him for his defiance and ambition. The victorious powers, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, agreed that Napoleon must be exiled to prevent any chance of a resurgence. Initially, Napoleon hoped to find refuge in America, but the British had other plans. The British Admiralty, which had been his greatest adversary throughout his reign, intercepted his escape attempts and, fearing his influence, took him into custody. Napoleon was transported aboard the HMS Bellerophon, a British warship, to the island of St. Helena, a remote British colony located in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from the European continent. St. Helena was a stark contrast to the grandeur and power that Napoleon had once known. The island, isolated and desolate, was more than 1,200 miles from the nearest land. The British authorities were determined to keep Napoleon isolated and under constant supervision, ensuring that he would have no opportunity to escape or once again challenge European stability. As Napoleon arrived at the island on October 15, 1815, he was effectively cut off from the world that he had once dominated. St. Helena was a bitter prison for Napoleon. His exile was not the peaceful retirement he might have hoped for, but a place of confinement and isolation. While he was allowed to live in relative comfort, his freedom was severely restricted. Napoleon's once great ambitions were now reduced to the confines of a lonely island, where he would spend the final years of his life in solitude, far from the grandeur of his imperial past. Napoleon Bonaparte's exile to St. Helena was as dramatic as the rise and fall of his empire. Isolated on this remote island in the South Atlantic, far from the French Empire he once ruled, Napoleon's life became a painful contrast to the glory he had once known. The island, barren and unwelcoming, was an ideal location for the British to ensure that Napoleon could never again pose a threat to Europe. Despite the seemingly tranquil surroundings, Napoleon's days on St. Helena were far from peaceful. Instead, they were filled with frustration, reflection, and a relentless yearning for the life he had lost. Upon his arrival on St. Helena in October 1815, Napoleon was placed under the watchful eyes of the British authorities. The island, part of the British Empire, was not large, only 47 square miles, and its rugged terrain made it an inhospitable place to live. Napoleon was given a residence called Longwood House, a dilapidated estate located on a hill. Though the house provided a roof over his head, it was poorly maintained, damp, and uncomfortable. The conditions were far from what Napoleon had been accustomed to during his years as emperor, and the environment only added to his growing sense of frustration. The British authorities assigned a governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, to oversee Napoleon's imprisonment. Lowe's relationship with Napoleon was tense and antagonistic. Lowe took every precaution to ensure Napoleon's isolation, restricting his communication with the outside world and monitoring his movements closely. Napoleon's correspondence was heavily censored, and he was only allowed to interact with a small circle of companions. Among those closest to him were a handful of loyal servants, including Bertin, a former valet, and Anna Marquis, his personal physician. Napoleon's interactions with his companions and the small number of visitors he received were his only means of connection to the outside world. Although his freedom was greatly restricted, Napoleon did not completely abandon his intellectual pursuits. He spent much of his time dictating his memoirs and reflecting on his past. Despite his diminishing health, Napoleon remained intellectually sharp, engaging in philosophical discussions and occasionally rewriting the history of his reign. He viewed his exile as a means to shape his legacy, believing that time would eventually restore his reputation and justify his actions. He also began to look inward, often pondering what had gone wrong during his reign and contemplating the mistakes that led to his downfall. Yet, as the years wore on, Napoleon's health deteriorated. The isolation, combined with a harsh climate and stress, took its toll on his body and mind. His once vibrant spirit seemed to fade with each passing year, though his mind still clung to the idea that he could one day return to power. The relentless cycle of reflection, illness, and frustration weighed heavily on him, as Napoleon found himself a prisoner of his own past, unable to escape the empire he had once ruled. As Napoleon Bonaparte's time on St. Helena wore on, his health began to deteriorate rapidly. The once indomitable man who had conquered much of Europe, whose vitality and energy seemed boundless, was now confronting the harsh reality of aging and illness. The years spent in exile took a heavy toll on his body, exacerbated by the relentless isolation and the bleak conditions of his imprisonment. Napoleon's physical decline was slow but unmistakable, and it became clear to those around him that the end was near at first. Napoleon's illness was mild, and he could still engage in intellectual pursuits, dictating his memoirs and reflecting on his reign. However, by 1817, his health began to deteriorate in earnest. He complained of stomach pains, which grew increasingly severe, and his once energetic demeanor became subdued. His loyal physician, Anna Marquis, attended to him regularly, but despite medical treatment, the cause of Napoleon's suffering remained unclear. Some historians have speculated that his ailments were the result of the long-term effects of the harsh conditions on St. Helena: poor diet, damp surroundings, and constant stress from his confinement. Napoleon himself believed that his deteriorating health was the result of poison, possibly a deliberate attempt by his captors to hasten his demise. He became increasingly paranoid and anxious, convinced that the British had poisoned him in a final effort to end his life. However, there is little evidence to support this claim, and modern medical experts have suggested that Napoleon's illness was most likely the result of stomach cancer, a disease that ran in his family. His father had died from the same condition, and symptoms such as abdominal pain, nausea, and weight loss. As his condition worsened, Napoleon became weaker and more bedridden. His physical appearance changed. He grew gaunt, and his once sharp features softened. The emperor who had once commanded entire armies was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. His mental acuity remained intact for a time, and he continued to dictate his memoirs and engage in discussions with his companions. However, his ability to manage the pain and his growing sense of despair took a toll on his spirit. In the months leading up to his death, Napoleon's suffering became unbearable. He spent long hours in his bed, reflecting on his past and the empire he had lost. The loss of his health and the limitations of his confinement seemed to amplify his sense of loss and regret. For a man who had once shaped the course of history, the slow decline into illness must have been a bitter irony. In his final days, Napoleon faced not just the physical decline of his body, but also the realization that his empire and his dreams of returning to power were lost forever. By the spring of 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's health had reached its final stages. The once great emperor, who had risen from obscurity to rule over much of Europe, now lay weak and frail on the remote island of St. Helena. His physical decline had been a slow and painful process, exacerbated by the hardships of his exile. He spent his final days in Longwood House, the residence where he had lived for much of his confinement. His body, worn from years of stress, illness, and isolation, was now succumbing to the effects of a fatal disease. Napoleon's ailments had worsened significantly over the previous months. His abdominal pain, once intermittent, had become constant and unbearable. He had lost significant weight and was often unable to eat or keep food down. His mental faculties remained sharp, but his once indomitable energy had dwindled. His doctor, Frederick Annemarchi, continued to attend to him, but his condition deteriorated with little hope of recovery. On May 5, 1821, after weeks of declining health, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. He passed away in his bed at Longwood House, surrounded by a few loyal companions and attendants. The cause of death, according to Annemarchi, was stomach cancer, the same disease that had taken the life of his father. While Napoleon had long suspected poisoning, modern medical analysis supports the idea that cancer was the most likely cause, especially considering the family history of the illness. Napoleon's death was met with a mixture of grief and indifference across the world. In France, his passing sparked an outpouring of mourning among his supporters, while his former enemies in Europe were largely indifferent. To many, Napoleon had been a tyrant, a man whose wars and ambitions had caused immense suffering. Yet to others, especially in France, he remained a symbol of national pride and glory. His legacy as a military genius and a reformer was still alive in the collective memory of his countrymen. In the days following his death, Napoleon's body was embalmed, and a funeral procession was held on May 9, 1821. His body was buried in a simple grave on the island of St. Helena, marked by a modest tomb. However, his story was far from over. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, Napoleon's remains were exhumed and returned to France, where they were reburied with great ceremony at Les Invalides in Paris, where they rest to this day. His death, though the end of his physical presence, marked the beginning of his eternal place in history. Napoleon Bonaparte's death on May 5, 1821, did not mark the end of his influence. In the years following his demise, his legacy evolved into something far greater than even he could have imagined during his lifetime. Napoleon's life had been one of incredible ambition, military brilliance, and unrelenting drive, but also of tragic downfall and personal sacrifice. His reign, though short-lived, left a profound impact on France and the rest of Europe, influencing the course of history long after his death. Napoleon's legacy in France was especially enduring. He is remembered not only as a military genius, but also as a statesman who brought important reforms to the country. His most notable contribution was the Napoleonic Code, which laid the foundation for modern civil law systems in many parts of the world. The Code, which abolished feudal laws and provided equality under the law, still influences legal systems today, particularly in countries such as France, Italy, Spain, and many countries in Latin America. Napoleon's military innovations also continue to shape modern warfare. He introduced new tactics, such as the corps system, which allowed armies to operate independently but in concert with each other, vastly improving strategic flexibility. His emphasis on rapid mobilization, concentration of force, and decisive battles became core principles in military doctrine. The legacy of his battles, especially the Battle of Austerlitz, is still studied at military academies worldwide. However, Napoleon's legacy is also marked by the immense suffering his wars caused across Europe. His ambition for empire led to countless lives lost, the destruction of cities, and the displacement of millions. The Napoleonic Wars, while achieving some of his goals, also left Europe ravaged, and the political and economic toll of his reign was immense. Yet even his enemies recognized his unparalleled talent and brilliance. Napoleon's impact extended far beyond his death. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, attempted to restore Europe to its pre-Napoleonic state, but the boundaries of European politics and identity had been forever changed. Napoleon's imperial ambitions sparked a nationalist wave across Europe, and the unification of Germany and Italy in the 19th century were influenced by the ideas he had spread. Even in his exile, Napoleon remained an enduring symbol of the revolutionary spirit, a man who, despite his faults, had once challenged the old order of monarchies and aristocracies. Napoleon's name, though synonymous with ambition and war, also became a symbol of resilience, leadership, and visionary reform. While he ultimately fell from power, his legacy continues to be debated, celebrated, and scrutinized to this day. Napoleon Bonaparte's life and death remain one of the most fascinating and debated legacies in world history. From his humble beginnings on the island of Corsica to his dramatic rise as the Emperor of the French, Napoleon's journey was one of exceptional achievements and equally profound flaws. His exile on St. Helena and eventual death at the age of 51 marked the end of an era, but the story of Napoleon continued to evolve long after his passing, solidifying his place as one of the most iconic figures in history. Napoleon's political and military legacy is undeniable. As emperor, he redefined Europe with the Napoleonic Code, which not only influenced the legal systems of France, but left an indelible mark on the legal frameworks of countries around the world. In Latin America, many nations adopted the principles of the Code as they sought independence from colonial powers. In Europe, Napoleon's administrative reforms streamlined the governance of conquered territories, creating systems that outlasted his empire. These reforms were integral in shaping the modern European state and continue to influence contemporary legal and political systems. On the battlefield, Napoleon's tactics are studied and revered to this day. He was a master of maneuver warfare, constantly seeking to surprise and outflank his enemies. His concept of battlefield flexibility, where troops operated in self-sufficient units, corps, but could still be centrally coordinated, was revolutionary. Battles like Austerlitz, Leipzig, and Borodino remain pivotal studies in military strategy. His military genius, however, could not overcome the logistical and strategic missteps that marked his downfall, particularly in the Russian campaign of 1812, which ultimately led to his decline. Yet, Napoleon's empire was also built on war and conquest, leading to massive destruction across Europe. The Napoleonic Wars resulted in the loss of millions of lives, and his imperial ambitions left much of Europe scarred by years of conflict. His quest for domination also led to the exploitation of the peoples he conquered and the enforcement of his absolute rule through military might. His reign, though groundbreaking in terms of reform and governance, was equally marked by oppression and tyranny. In terms of his personal legacy, Napoleon is often viewed as both a hero and a villain. To the French, he was a symbol of national pride and power, a leader who had taken France from the brink of collapse to the height of European dominance. To others, especially in the countries he invaded, he remains a figure of tyranny and imperialism, whose wars wreaked havoc across the continent. Napoleon's life invites both admiration and criticism, and his legacy continues to provoke strong emotions and debate. Napoleon Bonaparte's influence extends beyond his lifetime. His story is one of contradictions, brilliant yet flawed, reformer yet conqueror. His death on St. Helena did not diminish his status as one of history's most compelling figures. Whether admired or reviled, his impact on Europe and the world remains profound, securing his place in the annals of history as both a monumental figure and a cautionary tale.